If you look at sciences, the standard model of forming research teams would be to have one principal chief researcher. And that person would hire whatever postdocs or graduate students or maybe some kind of assistant professors if it's a senior person they need. You have Yuri here who works exactly like that. I mean, he's the boss. He just thinks, well, this is a project I need. These are the people I hire. Now, we thought that, first of all, if we do something like that, it's not a multidisciplinary project because the head of this laboratory, for example, belongs to some discipline. He can actually hire people from neighboring disciplines to do some technical work. If you need a physicist to do an experiment for a biologist, of course, they do that very easily. But that's not a multidisciplinary project by itself, right? So it means that in a team, there should be several people in equal position. Okay, if you have several people in equal position, you cannot have one person actually hiring all the team. You can somehow organize a process so the team gets together by itself on a kind of democratic basis. Hence comes the idea of this project design session. Now, people have been complaining that, well, it's impossible to come up with a serious research project in 3 days. And we know that is impossible. But the task of this team is not to come to the project that you will be obligated to do for the next 3 years if you are hired. The purpose of this session is actually to get together teams of people who have shared interest, who can think of projects to do together, and who can work together, who like each other, and can have some kind of distribution of roles in the teams that they feel that, well, they can complement each other. After we hire the team can change the project, obviously. They can reconfigure, they can actually think that, well, maybe it's better to go in a different direction that was defined over these 3 days. It's the next stage. We are not like a normal university. Normal university is a very uneven institution, usually with very loose couplings between things. So there are very different people in the university, right? There are people who do solitary research, there are people who do collective research, there are teams, there are people who are interested in theory, there are people who don't care about theory, there are people who hate theory. All of them somehow navigate the university, right? And they coexist in the university. If you do something like that in a school like this, it's not going to work because it's simply not big enough, right? So therefore, we have to choose. So this School of Advanced Studies is not for everyone, right? It doesn't mean that if you are a decent scholar, you could work here. It's not enough to be a decent scholar. If you are just a kind of scholar who doesn't want to be bothered by others interfering with their research and think that, well, you know best what to do with your research and you're better left alone, and maybe the administration can require you to to publish a paper every several months, and that's it, right? And the rest is up to you, and you don't want any interference. Well, this school is not for you, because this school where you have to work together, you have to work together with the team, the teams have to work together in a school, and that means that we are going to bother you as a solitary researcher with demands that come from other members of your team for the collective project, etc., etc.
We actually talked about what is meant by multidisciplinarity, right? I was trying to insist that we don't know what is meant by multidisciplinarity. And so I think my question to you, to the board, would be, do you? Or do you guys actually have, I mean, you as a collective whole, right? Do you guys know what you mean by multidisciplinarity? I'm not sure that I would know how to answer that myself, and I'm not sure that we could as a group. And so I wonder, do you guys as a collective know what you mean by that, and is it useful to have a definition of that?
I'll take a stab at Margaret's question from an internal perspective, because I sat where you sat a year ago. I'm sitting here and somewhat feeling awkward half the time. So I also don't know what multidisciplinarity is, but I've had to develop a working definition of it over the course of a year. And this with my team's actually awkwardly sitting behind me. So here they are. And the definition that I shared it yesterday during the biology anthropology team's presentation, model organisms. And the definition that we've come up with is one of diplomacy. And diplomacy means that you're still coming from home disciplines. You still have a space, a spatial spot, a disciplinary home. But diplomacy also entails a certain amount of treason. A little bit, you have to have a little spirit of treason to your homeland if you're going to do good diplomacy. You have to be a little bit willing to leave your homeland behind and be tugged in a different direction. Then this is sort of what I understand of multidisciplinarity, and I saw that yesterday, especially in the with the biologists. They seemed a little treasonous to biology, and this is what I was bringing up. There's also an aspect of and Christian here right now? He had this idea of agonistic memory. He takes this idea from Chantal Mouffe, but Mouffe is also taking it from Nietzsche. Nietzsche's idea of agonism versus antagonism. I think this is idea of individuals agonistically sort of pulling and driving and chafing against one another. Not a hierarchy, but this sort of rubbing against one another. This a competition, not a goal-oriented competition. We don't know what we want from you guys. You guys don't know what you want from each other, but it's like this competition to make, it's not goal-oriented competition, but it's competition to create vitality or something. And I think that's another definition of multidisciplinarity. Thanks.
The central hypothesis. Humans and technology are coevolutionary, and the technological environment has now exceeded our cultural and biological adaptations. We looked at the dominant alternatives to such an approach. Post-human politics have done a little bit of work there. Systems theory explains a lot about our coordination with technology as adaptive creatures. And we also looked at our current dealings with technology as a natural consequence of Moore's law. And nothing more. We don't think that's the case.
And what we were looking at is mostly sort of discrete applications of looking at technology and specific instances. And what we're trying to look at is something that's much more holistic and much more dealing with the system as it relates to human behavioral evolution and the rapidly changing technological environment, not just computers, but as we said, biotech, and even we were speculating in the near future, space exploration is going to be another one of these paradigm shifts for us that's going to open us up and create vulnerabilities in how we behave now if we don't pre-adapt ourselves to the changes that are going to follow from these technologies. What was happening with cybersecurity, we didn't prepare for it, but from the introduction of the first virus that went on your 5.5 floppy disk, there were threats coming, and we did anticipate that there could be this internet, this cloud, this vast information system where every bit of your life information now, including your genetic makeup, is out in the cloud. And we didn't prepare for it, and so now we're stuck in a reactive situation where cybersecurity is reacting to the threats as they come up, rather than building a structure that could have insulated us from a lot of those threats. But one of the things that we're looking at that's changed in the general pattern of human evolution is the rate of change. That as we enter what's been called the Anthropocene, a geological epoch that's defined by human action rather than geological action.
Sort of 20 years or so, like for example, there's a Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, and there's recent work by Bruno Latour on modes of existence, etc. So what's wrong with kind of their holistic views? So just why do you think actually your sort of holistic take would be kind of different or more interesting?
Yeah, what I'm concerned about is also the idea of impact. We usually treat technology as a kind of agent impacting our lives, but technologies are made by people, right?
Sure. I mean, I think maybe we can treat this in the duality way as well. That there's a benefit, there's a negative effect to it. But you know, these things are symbiotic. I don't think you could treat it as just, you know, this is an external, this is just something that we can divorce itself from the environment and say that, hey, listen, this is really, really something new, because this is exactly what politicians do. This is what policymakers do. Hey, well, we've got a problem with our toolbox. Let's put this thing in there because we've never heard about it before, and it may solve all our problems. And one of the reasons why I expect from the policy perspective this doesn't work is exactly because it's a product of a human, let's say, perception of what technology should do for us under really, really difficult conditions.
Biohacking is really just starting, right?
What is biohacking? That was my actual next
Okay,
question.
so there's kind of a subculture movement, if you could classify it like that, of people who are self-taught molecular biologists or biologists, or however you want to call them, or however they call themselves, where they're trying to do biological experiments in their garages and try to integrate that with IT, with gadgets that then they can put inside their bodies, either to monitor physical activity or to deliver drugs on a periodic, at different periods and so on. So nothing of that is regulated, right? So we know, I guess you work in a related field, so you know that when we do experiments in a laboratory, right, you need to order chemicals that are dangerous. You need to order substances that are, can be a biohazard depending on the substances, right? So now you have this community of biohackers that are, ordering some of this stuff. Nothing is regulated. There's no regulations. There's no policy. And they're disposing. How are they disposing of these substances? So maybe we should be monitoring also these companies, or making, putting some policies in place. That the idea behind this is that we wanted to come up with, we wanted to be one step ahead of the game and not repeat the same mistakes that happened, for example, with the internet and the cybersecurity thing.
Now, this definitely sounds way more interesting than the internet, because internet is an obvious thing, and this is not so it's more relevant. So, but why do you think that somebody will allow you to actually put the policy in place? Say, oh, we will develop policies. It's great, but why do you think that somebody will even let you do that?
Or listen, right, to what they develop.
No, I think one of the things is, again, because we're saying that we could develop discrete policy recommendations, it's, we're not going out there and starting to proselytize about, this is a fantastic product, this is the way you should be doing things. Mm-hmm. We know everything that goes on. So, hey, listen, guys, don't go to Boston Consulting, don't go to, any of these other major firms, come to us. That's part of what we would like to do. But I think it's one of the things where we sit there and say, again, it's about learning lessons, sharing information, and maybe what works for you is something that we can help you develop over long term.
So basically you're envisioning that you can actually advise, let's say, legislature or something.
Yeah, I think advisory is a good word as well. Recommendation is the same thing.
We live in an era of political polarization, and most policy think tanks have a particular political complexion, it seems to me, and I wonder if you've established whether you have common political goals, or whether this might be an important factor in any policy recommendations you might come up with.
What would you say to the following idea that, changes in society, such as internet or new technologies, are always driven just by the technology makers, such as the big universities, MIT, and the thousands of others, plus, of course, capital. Both go hand in hand very well. So what would theorists, like philosophers, policymakers, what could be the concrete means to do something?
Your talk about threats might be sort of buying into this rhetoric of threat, and that this brave new world is part of the problem, that we're not really in a brave new world. And I guess this sort of goes back to Max's question, but I also think Benjamin's work here on helping talk between creationists and evolutionary scientists would make a lot of sense. Like, I wonder if there might be a way in which you want to do is like a criticism of Anthropocene. We've entered a brave new world. What you're really trying to do is actually show that we're not so much in this threatened, precarious situation. We're not needing to do all this adaptations, but we want to do something. We want to challenge this rhetoric of constantly needing to change.
I disagree with the idea, with anybody's hypothesis that we're overreacting here. These are all the early warning signs are there. You know, we use the internet and cybersecurity as there's a lot of work on that. There's 25 years we've had this. We've got you know, we wouldn't have enough time in 3 years to talk about, to even read all the cybersecurity literature. I mean, the one you gave me today was 101 pages. That'll take me at least a weekend after this whole thing is over with just to get through. But we can take the lessons learned. In project management, that's the first thing you do at the end of the project. What are the lessons learned? So the next time we open up a project, we can say, oh, we know these things. We don't have to anticipate every risk. We can anticipate a lot of them based on what we already know.
The reason majority of humans embrace technology is that is not replacing anything. If it was, people would be rebelling against technology. When you go to YouTube, you're not really experiencing anything new. You're not replacing your rabbi or your priest. You're watching that same rabbi, but maybe that rabbi that you're watching on your YouTube channel is better than your local rabbi in your little synagogue. And it's the same with everything else. I don't see any, to me it sounds a bit strange to be.
I think we pretty much, all agree that there are important, interesting, also dangerous things going on that need attention. Our question is whether or not your team or your project is actually the right answer to that.
Incentivized within academia to pursue their own field stuff. If they're going to collaborate, they're going to generally collaborate with people who are in very close disciplines. They're not going to branch out and do what we're doing here. Like I would never have ever collaborated with these guys if I hadn't met them here. You know, I mean, just right, terrible people.
Well, no. That explains why you are different, but doesn't explain why you are better. What is it that you can gain from each other's expertise?
That's the other thing, though. All these other people don't have the time to do it. They might be able to do it much better than us. They're not going to. We're here. We're gonna be best at it because we're gonna be the only ones doing it.
We're not going to be able to do everything here. And I think we're going to have to outsource a lot of times. For instance, the only person that has IT experience in the group is Benjamin from a technical perspective, and he was self-trained. And I think one of the things is that we have to admit where our, let's say, expertise boundaries are. And we're going to have to, I think, and this is, again, an added value, that we're going to be able to plug into existing groups, or we're going to be able to sit there and say, hey, we want to cooperate with you guys, we want to outsource because we think that this is something that we can mutually benefit from.
Yes, but then you will have to really make clear what's for them the added value, which they do not have.
I think I might be able to add something to what he said. So I think that basically, if we're dealing with technologies that we, at least one of us is already an expert in. So for example, I'll take the biohacking example, right? I mean, whatever biohacking experts or biohackers are going to be doing is going to be following what experts are doing. They're never, well, at least in the next few years, I would not expect biohackers to be at the forefront just because they wouldn't have access to the latest equipment, right? I mean, you require millions of dollars for that. So, from that standpoint, I should always be able to somewhat predict, what their advances are, because they would follow in our footsteps, right? So if it follows...
This is clearly a good example of one technology where you have relevant expertise. Maybe, unless you want to hire a lot of other people, you might want to focus on one technology, one aspect of this. It's just an idea.
Yeah.
It's really to follow up on that. So I was wondering, like anthropological question, where exactly will be your case studies? So where do you think, because the Brave New World is actually pretty big, so where exactly you'll be doing this research?
One thing that's kind of tied to what you were talking about is that we're trying to help change the paradigm in which we think about the introduction of new technology, looking at the relationship of culture to technology. Most of you are probably too young to remember, but during the Cold War, I belonged to a group called Beyond War, which was based on studies of macaque monkeys that if 10% of the population learned a new behavior, that would eventually become fixed in the population and spread to the entire population. What we want to do is help shape the way that people think about the relationship with technology. We tend to interact with new technology in isolates rather than in looking at this more processual, systematic approach. And so I think if people expand the way they think about their interaction with technology, if they begin to learn that, oh, you know what, I am dealing with death on the internet now rather than dealing with it in my church or synagogue, that I want to learn how to do something new, I go to YouTube and I learn it. I don't go to someone older in my community to teach me.
But still, then it would be good to know which specific fields of scholarship you want to involve, to make it a little bit more concrete.
Well, maybe I will just, to add to that, right? I mean, it looks that like you are going to take this middle ground. So on the one hand, there are like actual scientists or actual people who develop technology that don't have time or incentive to think outside the concrete tasks that they are solving for corporations or elsewhere. Right? On the other hand, there are these philosophers who have this overarching theory of the brave new world, and they're not specific enough. They don't look at concrete things, and they maybe don't know experts. Again, they don't have incentive to look at specific technologies they have because they paid to get a broader picture, right? And you want to take this middle ground, so kind of between, you're not philosophical enough to compete with Latour, and therefore you don't have to read him. But at the same time, you're kind of not specific enough as a scientist, therefore you can actually do something in the areas where you don't have particular specific expertise, but just know something because you're kind of in this middle ground. Is this correct understanding of your project?
By focusing on some examples that, some of us have expertise in, we hope to come up with some general principles that should be able to be applied across other problems, regardless of the, specificity of the nature or the technological expertise of the problem, right? Because when you look at, you look at the cybersecurity in internet, you look at, security with biohacking or some problems that can come up, say, with space mining, right? And something that we've discussed was, for example, so I don't know if that kind of also
just
things.
For the sake of clarity, so you take an example which is known because it's all like internet, right, or space exploration, right? You derive some kind of principles from that and apply it to a different field like biohacking. But you do that in some kind of concrete way. It's not that you kind of build a theory of everything, theory of technological progress where everything works, right? I mean, which is applicable to everything. You kind of more specifically say, well, there is a similarity between internet and biohacking, for example, right? And that's why principles derived from this apply to that, right?
The idea or the research hypothesis or the statement, so to say, that current models of citizenship are based on a legal contractual model which originated in the Roman legal tradition, and they have been reduced to, well, within the modern liberal dimension, they have been reduced to Western liberal dimensions of status, rights, participation in, and identity. And in order to respond to this crisis that arise from this model, we propose to to go back and to look at other models of citizenship and of belonging, which are all glued together, connected by the idea of an existential citizenship.
Clarification, yeah, it's a very good point that we are actually trying to move beyond this modern Western liberal understanding of citizenship, thinking that it's irrelevant. We should conceptualize in different terms. And the meaning can be different, significance can be different of these forms of belonging. We're just rather speaking to the literature on citizenship. It's a very vibrant and fastly developing. That's why probably this misleading title.
I'm a political theorist, so I liked it. I too worry, like Nikolai, a bit about citizenship. I think you answered it partially. I think the link with sovereignty can be partially overcome looking toward how different indigenous groups, indigenous traditional knowledge speaks about sovereignty or has taken up the language of sovereignty. I also think it can be taken up with how Rousseau talks about sovereignty. There's different lineages of sovereignty in the West that's not just reducible to like a Lockean or Hobbesian sovereignty. So I think that that's one way to go. But really what I think you're looking at is modes of political belonging. It's plural. And you talk about citizenship, and citizenship is singular. So you're looking at modes of political belonging in a plural sense. What are you going to look at? What sources are you going to look at to develop your existential models of?
I mean, I'm already, for example, in my case, I'm already doing research on Rohingya refugees, which is ethnographic research. And I'm already doing research in Indian citizenship, which is everyday experience of state. How do people kind of everyday experience bureaucracy and corruption in their life? So I'm already doing into this fieldwork and very much qualified also because I'm a sociologist as well as social anthropologist. In India, they don't make a distinction between these two fields actually. They are all the same. So maybe
it seems like a little bit different. Citizenship is also a very broad term. There are people, there's the idea of political citizenship, there's the idea of social citizenship, there's the idea of sexual citizenship. Like, could you be more specific what aspects are you going to analyze and study? Because there are there are dozens of concepts of citizenship highlighting different aspects. And
there's a cultural citizenship, there's pharmaceutical citizenship.
We talked about things like citizen science, netizens. We talked quite extensively in very broad terms that we decided if we went into so much detail that it would in fact derail the bigger issues. I think part of it, one of the key issues is this sense of crisis over citizenship and political participation because of the narrow sort of definition of citizenship in terms of these contractual issues. So part of it really is about reimagining in order to maybe breathe life into people's engagement with the concept of citizenship.
What we are trying to drive at is a concept of belonging that is subjectively meaningful. So in other words, I mean, if you go back to Cicero, I mean, not to mention ancient Greek, and Cicero's Republican concept of citizenship, which was picked up by St. Augustine. The way how Cicero defined the Republic is that people are bound together by their love for the Republic, and people become a good citizen of the Republic by dying fighting for the Republic, meaning that it is subjectively meaningful. It is, I mean, your whole being is at stake in your citizenship. So, and St. Augustine in The City of God translates that into one becomes a good citizen of Christianity by dying fighting for Christianity. So in other words, it's a subjectively meaningful belonging. It is not citizenship as a kind of, I mean, the passive citizenship, which began with Roman Empire, which is, I mean, I want my rights to be protected, and I mean, that was this concept of citizenship. And what we are trying to drive at is really conceptual engineering and conceptual amelioration. The current, I mean, the contemporary, the dominant concept of citizenship was basically a modern Western liberal concept. So, so we are both looking to the historical other and the cultural other for alternatives to give us some inspiration to so-called ameliorate this existing concept of citizenship, which has failed.
But at the same time, like when we do empirical studies, of course, in a sense, we study both, like, you know, concepts and effects. In a sense that, for instance, if you look at the political discourse, and like it may be cast in terms of citizenship, right? Like using this in Russia, for instance, they use this frame, citizenship, but they emphasize very specific issues. So their understanding of citizenship can be different.
I mean, does it actually seem like you're bringing a framework through these very giant, you know, promises and descriptions, right, of citizenship that's actually going to help in any of these individual studies? Like, what is the framework here?
We use both a historical framework ever since ancient Athens until the age of globalization. And as a matter of fact, in one of my responses, I already talked about Habermas, Ben Habib, Michael Ignatieff, tons of people, Iris Marion Young, I know a whole list of them.
And something to keep in mind, we are pitching this as a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary presentation, and I think we purposefully left it sort of broad and open in terms of its presentation, not wanting to privilege one particular field or set of authors over another.
Yeah, but you know, where I, to follow up on Matthew's actually question, right? I mean, I think you have to decide whether or not you, I mean, it's one thing that you want to look at particular populations or particular groups of people, particular historical periods and say, well, look, citizenship meant something differently or means something different from these people, or they have some different concept different from citizenship. That's interesting to know. That's period. Then it's a kind of series of local studies. Or you can make a kind of, again, returning to the first team, a kind of policy suggestion that there should be kind of universal United Nations approved notion of new citizenship that would be more efficient in contemporary world, which you derive from these individual cases, but then you generalize. So whether or not you need the second stage in your project or not, I mean, it's very different projects then, right?
First of all, to be very honest, I don't really understand that why do you need to make this conceptual distinction between doing different case studies as it is and then going to some framework. Where from this framework is coming? It is, the whole frameworks came, I mean, there is no such artificial distinction between grand theory or theorization and empirical cases. I mean, all social theories, be it even abstract, grand political theories, are made from particular instances. And I think, there's a good book called, I think, Hegel in Haiti.
In Haiti,
yeah.
yes.
And there they discuss it clearly that this artificial distinction between theory and how the empirical instances by which the theory is made is a Western epistemological philosophical tradition. I mean, we don't really believe that there is such a grand distinction. I mean, the question, for example, Matthew asked is, I believe it's an irrelevant question. For example, why? Because suppose Agamben says that that the idea of statelessness puts puts the question of sovereignty and law into crisis. Or Hannah Arendt says that the idea of statelessness puts the entire idea of sovereignty or legality into crisis. It is precisely from the Nazi era and all those studies that this idea emerged, where she is discussing that. So if you make a divorce between the theory and the empirical aspect from which it emerged, what will happen is what happened with Hegel, and that is he came up with this whole idea of master-slave dialectic from his idea of the Haitian revolution, but in his theory, the Haitian revolution was just shoved into the back place because he doesn't really want to talk about or engage with that slave rebellion rather than talk probably some modern concepts of Renaissance, French Revolution, whatever, right?
Maybe my question will sound kind of super simplistic and stupid, but what is not clear to me, it's the actually usefulness and applicability of the results from your study to the ordinary citizens. So from the presentation that actually that you showed, I mean, it was, the goal sounded like, I mean, you want to publish a paper, a book, make a movie, that's it. Okay, so if it is so, I mean, it sounds a little bit a strange kind of goal because, like, for example, I also do lots of research and do publish papers, but the papers is only a way of communicating the important findings, like of how to treat the infections or something like that. So in your case, I mean, so what is actually that ultimate goal? Okay, maybe that's what an intermediary goal, it's okay, right? So to publish, because it sounds like if you do it, I mean, then there would be nothing else left. So, so what is that ultimate goal, I mean, which would be maybe translated in some sort of, I don't know, applications or like how the ordinary citizens would feel it?
Well, I think that throwing into the world, let's say, new... Isn't it on? Yeah, so I think that throwing into the world, so to say, new ideas on, of political philosophy or new ideas on belonging, is a legitimate goal in itself, which does not necessarily have to have an applicability, the following day. It's not how political philosophy works, but it will contribute, to broaden the landscape of what is being imagined and what is being thought of in particular contexts and about particular topics.
Maybe to elaborate on this more from sociological perspective. So basically, the problem is, for instance, you have these policymakers and different UN agencies, for instance, NGOs, and even diplomats coming to certain regions dealing with the refugee crisis, statelessness, and so on. So, and the way they think now, often the documents are written, they're based on this. Okay, the most important thing is for them to rights to vote in local elections. Maybe it's not what is important in particular countries, and maybe the way to to look at the problems of refugees and stateless populations somewhere is needs to be changed, and the starting points need to be different.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Matthew's question because I think you guys were just speaking past each other. I think you guys agree with each other. I think that his point was that you guys have really cool, Erica has really cool interests in how art is a way to live citizenship or practice citizenship, and she's interested in this in a specific spot. Arnab has certain ways of this in India, and that there could be other ones. But right now, it looks like you guys are Hegel in Haiti. Right now, it looks like you guys don't have that, how you presented it today. Can we go back to that first, and because I'm going to say this in a very more pedantic way, even. When I read, one more back. That first thing, that first point, that to me reads like that was completed in 1958 when Hannah Arendt published The Human Condition. That's exactly the human condition right there. And okay, but well, however it is, it's like conceptually speaking, you have a really old model and not that great of a model. So you look like you have an old. This is the Hegel in Haiti thing. What would be cool is when you start at point 2, and then you let your practice build your theory. Right now, you're using Hannah Arendt's model of statelessness to do your theory, and then talking about doing your research. Do your research. And then, because you have more points than Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt talked about statelessness, but you're talking about how citizenship is now challenged by including non-human things. I really like this point. You had a whole list of other things. So do this first, and then let the model build itself.
I mean, do you have an assumption that it's going to be a coherent world in the future as well, right? It will become some kind of hegemonic thing like liberal democracy was in the past. That somehow things brought about by internet, for example, are coextensive with things brought about by refugee crisis. That this is all part of the same kind of movement, and there is some kind of new notion of citizenship that fits both of these very different, actually, developments. If you look at what happens with, in Silicon Valley, you probably will have a very different development of citizenship as opposed to what happens in Syria.
I think you're now asking. What's behind this sort of disintegrated citizenship, like already, and what will be behind this disintegrated citizenship in the future? Like you have this digital divide, you have one things are important in Western democracies, other things are important in least developed countries, and so on. I think behind of it is like the easiest answer is global inequalities. And they have been, they will probably continue. And the second thing is behind that is, of course, international politics, and to what extent the world is bipolar, multipolar, and so on. This evolution will affect also. Perhaps technologies will interact with that, but it's a question mark even in the studies of technologies. To what extent they are empowering states or empowering citizens? To what extent they are? There is a digital divide which exacerbates global inequalities, or rather, it's a way for people to earn more money and achieve the higher status, even if they are currently deprived of resources. So,
okay.
The Naked Soldier. We thought we'd begin with a quote that sort of animated our curiosity as we were sitting at breakfast this morning. So some of you may be familiar with Robert Graves. He was a British soldier in World War I. He wrote an autobiography about his experience called Goodbye to All That. And this is a quote that, as I said, that struck our attention. I only once refrained from shooting a German I saw while sniping from a knoll in the support line where we had a concealed loophole. I saw a German about 700 yards away, through my telescopic sights. He was taking a bath in the German third line. I disliked the idea of shooting a naked man, so I handed the rifle to the sergeant with me. Here, take this. You're a better shot than I am. He got him, but I had not stayed to watch. Now, this thing is not working. Oh, there we go. So just some observations that we made about this quote. There seems to be a recognition of similarity between the soldiers. He recognizes that he's killing a fellow combatant. We see this affect, this feeling that it's unsavory to kill, and yet there's this decision-making process that takes place. They can decide to shoot or to not shoot. And the question is, would there be repercussions if they chose not to? That makes up some of the moral dilemma. We also noted some of the homoerotic production of intimacy here. That this is a very intimate moment, seeing a naked man bathing from across the way, and so this struck us as an interesting moment. And we asked ourselves, is this possible today? And in particular, in relation to the conditions of technological warfare as we see them, it seems like this encounter isn't possible. Drones have rehabilitated this problem of the naked soldier, but in a way that totally transforms this experience. And so we noted some of the ways in which the contemporary moment transforms some of these original observations that we made. So now we see with drone warfare the ascription of militancy. So we see an expanded concept of the soldier. The naked soldier transforms into the enemy and to other. We see a transformation of affect, so it's not what the individual can tolerate, but what the system itself can tolerate, in terms of the criteria-based reasoning, the way that the system, the targeting process works. There's a transformation of moral judgment. There's an eradication of moral judgment, from the system. And we see, new forms of, different forms of vulnerability at play. Surveillance linked with violence. This seems quite a different, set of circumstances.
It looks like you will look at actually really very, as it were, Western, if not American, warfare. So, what kind of research locations you imagine? Particularly, I know you work in South Africa, or and you work on Buenos Aires and Mexico City, etc. So given your kind of expertise, just what kind of warfare and what kind of nakedness you might encounter, like this, not literal nakedness, but the kind of vulnerabilities that you're talking about. You might actually, what's the variety of these vulnerabilities that you might encounter in, African like a militia war, exactly, or somewhere there.
The naked soldier is exactly at the position where you try to pose your question. And the way we address the nakedness and militarism goes beyond the figure of a human being that is undressed and lying somewhere waiting to be shot or to be seen while taking a bath. Because what we are aiming at is to raise awareness about issues that are hardly addressed in more or less conservative societies, even in some developed societies, but probably from another perspective. And by raising awareness, we also want to call for a certain action that does not necessarily have to involve shooting by guns or bombs, but shooting at certain power discourses that maintain status quo.
So what we are claiming is that, for example, in the question of violence, all these thousands of books that have been, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of articles that have been written about violence, somehow had this blind spot. They never consider a naked soldier, kind of a metaphorical figure of nakedness, and if you actually introduce that into these discourses, you will actually transform them in a significant way.
No, we're not claiming that. First of all, this naked soldier does appear, right? Michael Walzer, right, political theorist, writes about this passage. Okay, this passage is already sort of circulating, right? What we want to do is we want to see if we can take a single heuristic, right, and carry this around to these different scenes, because we have these scenes we're grappling with about violence. We're not trying to say no one's grappled with violence or even no one's grappled with this heuristic. But if we can carry around this heuristic into these different scenes, and we can do it together, right? If there's a sort of moment of it, you know, there's a sort of a comparative character here, right? Where we have different scenes that we draw on in our different works. But if we can carry this heuristic around through these scenes, right, might something interesting happen? I would say if you carry anything around, something interesting will happen. If I carry that notepad thing around for 3 years, something interesting will happen. I don't know what, but I'm pretty sure something would.
Images and thoughts are based on violence. And this violence can be positive and constructive, as well as it can be negative and destructive. So if you approach images, what you're looking at right now, me being the most arrogant, the most aggressive, of course, object of your perception at the moment, you should maybe rethink the grades of violence to which we are exposed on a daily basis. And especially, not because there are so many books written on this issue, but because at the very moment of looking and at the very moment of thinking, you and you and you and you and you are being implicated into the processes of violence and exposure of violence. And these implications involve some kind of responsibility. And there are a number of works, not only in the contemporary art field, that manifest and demonstrate this in a much better way than I'm able to present today.
Undergraduate course, maybe termed The Naked Soldier. What exactly would be the chapters, and why would I send my daughter or son to the course rather than to another course?
I would say that the argument is that there are important issues that your daughter must be interested in, and this class is going to be about these issues, and therefore she must take it. But they don't give us an argument why they should take their particular class because of its intellectual content. Rather, they say it's about topics, it's about important topics, obviously, therefore take it. But I think the question was rather why competing with other courses which supposedly address the same issues, your course should be better because of its kind of academic content, because of its intellectual ideas, because of the theoretical frameworks that you use, but other courses about refugees, about victims, etc., don't use.
The naked soldier, for me, is a great metaphor. The question is the metaphor to what? And there are different options in our discussion, to warfare, to violence, to nakedness, to the feeling of a person living in the new world, which is transparent, with glass walls, a lot of options. And some of these options are on the slide. And because there are no answer what particular option you would like to choose, the scope of the project is not clear yet.
I'm not really sure, I like Andrei's question, like what aren't we seeing now that the heuristic of the naked soldier can help us see? And Max's question, I'm like, why the heuristic of the naked soldier? So I would try to reframe it as what you're trying to do instead is shed light on vulnerabilities or expose woundabilities. And why I don't like naked soldier is because naked soldier is too humanistic. And this is why you faltered with the first question about the drones. And this is why you'd falter about a question about ecological relationships and ecological relations. When you push to vulnerabilities or to woundability, you could maybe have more of a scope to talk about, yes, the drones, you're not just focusing on human-human relationships, but you can focus on wider relationships.
What's so humanistic about the naked? I mean, there is an imagination, right, in this text of of this sort of encounter that partly makes invisible, right, all these other relations and connections, right, that we would imagine outside of the text happening, right?
Right, I think, so how I understand this heuristic of the naked soldier is it's almost like, I don't know exactly what a heuristic is, to be honest, but to me it's like these glasses you put on, and it's the naked soldiers on the glasses, and now we're looking through the world, and everything we see is there's a naked soldier there. And this shows us new things about the world that we couldn't appreciate before. This is helpful. But what is it about, Andrei is asking, what is it about the world that we can't see when we're like this? and that now we're able to see. And what I think it helps us see is it helps us see conditions of woundability and vulnerability that we're not we're not aware of when we're like this. And I'm more interested personally in like the vulnerability that happens between like humans and the non-human world, or between like the drones or something. So I worry that the heuristic is limiting how you're framing it right now.
There is a question there. This comes actually from Tomasz Blushevich, which is our faculty member in exile, I would say. And I think that's a good question. He says, do private military companies such as Blackwater in the US make a soldier more or less naked compared to the era of national conscription armies like during World War I and World War II? So I propose that you use this heuristic device of a naked soldier to tell us something we don't know about the difference between World War II and contemporary warfare. Go ahead.
There are many more complexities, when you introduce, private contractors and drones. So I think, in a certain sense, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I can't fully at this moment, think about it. But I do think that I can answer that question, and I plan.
Can you reflect of what kind of this focus on a naked soldier could add to the research you've already been doing on automated warfare?
As I said, I was bringing the naked soldier was a First World War problem. I don't think the issue was that I don't think that people were thinking of the problem of drone warfare in terms of the problem of the naked soldier. So we were using the heuristic to explain the contemporary problem of drone warfare itself.
Okay, I have a couple of comments and maybe questions. I found that it was very sort of European and Western centric in the presentation. Things like the assumption that contemporary warfare is increasingly this sort of depersonalized experience. I mean, we can just think of what happened recently in Ukraine, or machete warfare in Papua New Guinea. It's like nice to think of it as some sort of abstraction that way. But I also found that there seemed to be an assumption that naked soldier, that the soldiers were men. What if they're children or women? And then another issue was about the function of the uniform. Is the naked person actually a soldier? Especially after World War I, and I'm sure you probably have an answer for this.
And the main questions, and in general, between the relationship between nakedness and vulnerability, which seems important to you. Well, to me, I mean, it's not the first time I met this kind of association, but I always wonder why these two things are thought to be connected. I mean, it seems that one of your assumptions is like, yeah, someone is naked, and therefore he or she is vulnerable. But to me, it's not true. But if you think at the very example you provided, where this naked soldier actually almost survived, because if it weren't for the second soldier, your naked soldier would have survived, and it almost survives precisely because he was naked. So I don't see, and therefore it was less vulnerable precisely because he was naked. So I mean, every time I met this association, I'm like, I don't see the point. And also I could think of many situations where someone is naked and yet he or she is not vulnerable, like someone going around naked in his apartment. Why should we think that he or she is vulnerable?
Contemporary forms of nakedness were to move away from literal nakedness and living under surveillance, which may include nakedness, but living under this condition of being observed in the most intimate moments of your life, seemed to be the interesting parallel there. So that's how we were, I think, trying to move from this historical example to the contemporary moment.
I also want to ask a question about this ontology of violence that you're assuming here, because I think the danger of a course like this and the kind of slightly manipulative emotional language that you're using is that you're going to interpolate certain students in your class as the people holding the gun and others as the people who are the target. based on their identities without knowing anything personal. You're assuming that the gaze is by default violent, and that anytime you're looking at somebody else, well, this is something that you said, maybe you don't all share it, but you know, the glasses that Zach was referring to with the naked soldier on them seem to me to you know, contain the danger that you, well, let me turn it into a question. What do you think is going to be the impact on your students of making an assumption that looking at somebody is automatically an act of violence?
So here we have a quote that the gaze is not producing violence, it's producing recognition, first of all. But second of all...
well, I think you misread that quote, because I think what happens there is that he passes the gun over to his, the shot over to his friend, because his friend is a better shot,
And
not because there's anything homoerotic going on there.
Okay, so he declines to participate in that moment of violence is how we read it. But over and above the quote, I mean, I hear you saying things about, like, is our class going to build in assumptions and differentiate between our students?
You're making all kinds of assumptions about. Okay. You're engaged in an identity political argument about, you know, who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed in a situation between a British soldier and a German soldier, where, you know, the member of the aggressive army is, you know, is the vulnerable character, and the British soldier is the aggressor. And I'm concerned that, you know, there are all kinds of assumptions that you're likely to make about who's an aggressor and who's a victim in situations where looking at somebody is automatically seen as violent.
Okay. I mean, if you stick with this project and with this team, right, which you don't have to do, but if you do, I mean, I think what we're really looking for, what all the questions suggest, is that you actually put this thing you want to do in a scholarly academic perspective, right? I mean, we have no doubts you can do an exhibition, you can actually do it tomorrow, right? We don't even have a space to do it. The question is, what are you going to contribute in a scholarly debate which has the frameworks, disciplines, disciplinary fields, contemporary debates, you know, controversies in which you can participate or which you can try to subsume on a kind of more general approach or whatever, right? We want to hear about that, because without this, I mean, we don't know whether or not to support your project, because your project, we don't understand what your project is about.
No, I think that's helpful, yeah.
There's no definition. It's an umbrella term, it's a broad topic. Although many related issues, many related topics are studied and defined by all kinds of disciplines, right? If you look at, for instance, at the question of loneliness, the question of social isolation, you know, millions of dollars are spent on those issues. Loneliness is recognized as a health issue, as a social issue. There is a legitimate concern about you know, the fact that people are getting more lonely. There was a study recently that right now people have fewer friends than 25 years ago in the United States. 30% of people don't have a person with whom they can talk about important issues. You know, we should take a step back, right? And perhaps we should actually focus on the issue of inner life, which so far has been studied by religious studies scholars, by psychologists. I mean, this is a topic that has been privatized by psychologists in so many different ways. So we want to do two things. We want to take a step back from the discussions of loneliness and isolation, focus on inner life, and also to get out of the psychological prison, right? To actually have philosophers, sociologists, and historians to attack that issue.
All right, so we began this discussion by talking about how inner life is being constantly encroached upon by the public. Public institutions, as you mentioned, public life, all these sorts of things. So where the historical contribution comes in is that this sort of encroachment is not something that has always been there. That it's been there, but it hasn't always been at the state that it is now. And so looking historically at the 20th century allows us to understand alternatives to the almost totalizing encroachment of the public on private lives and inner lives. And it allows us to understand how agency has factored in historically and how agency may factor in the contemporary.
Right, and this brings us to more contemporary developments. With the rise of digital technologies, we see how the boundary between the public and the private is getting blurred. And my contribution here is how technologies affect the discussion or the topic of inner life.
And I work specifically with Foucault's idea of biopower or biopolitics, or what I like to call biopolitical capitalism. And I have this thesis that biopower needs life, right? So it co-opts life, whatever we mean by that. But it not only needs the life that it co-opts, it also needs real life. In other words, the life that it precisely can't co-opt. So the life that's always escaping it. In my work, I talk about this as desire. So I'm interested in thinking about desire as a form of inner life, as a mode of inner life today, and in proposing that maybe the reason that we keep returning in recent years to this idea that we're sort of running out of desire, that desire is this resource that's becoming harder and harder to sustain, that might be a form of the death of inner life today.
You know that there is a great problem with meaning of life. What kind of life do you mean? Is it social life, or is it a life in a biological sense? In the case of biopower and your metaphor of feeding, it seems biological, but in your case, distinction between public and private, it's social. What do you mean here? Social, bios, or biological, Joe? Thank you.
Yeah, well, this is where we are hoping that that three different approaches to precisely that question could yield a sort of richer answer, right? So this is why, after hours of talking about this today, we decided that rather than agreeing on one approach, the most fruitful thing would be to show three different frameworks, including the difference at the level on which you're talking about, right? So I am talking about life as bios, and yeah, I think what we're trying to do is arrive at this, is show that it's possible to arrive at something like the same place, even though we have three such distinct frameworks. What that place is, before you ask us, what that place is, we don't know, right? Because, I mean, I see you roll your eyes, but because inner life is precisely the sort of thing that can't be defined, right? And I understand that that's not very satisfying right away, but what if it's actually true? That inner life is precisely that thing that we can't define, that it's always sort of escaping us, right? If that's true, that doesn't make it any less of an important question to ask, right?
Yeah, still, I mean, I appreciate that it's something difficult to define, etc. But nonetheless, would you like to give it a go? And probably all of you, like all three of you, give us like a working definition of what it actually is for you inner life. Because I mean, I'm confused. I don't know what are you talking about. Because of course, the isolation, atomization, and loneliness is not the same thing as inner life at all, is it? So anyway, I would like to just hear working definitions of this, something which is difficult to catch.
Loneliness, isolation is a symptom of something that, you know, of a certain problem with your private sphere. That, yeah.
All right, so I'd go back to the question of how it's defined in relation to the public. And by that, I mean that I think we can, or I would argue that when you are conceiving of your inner life, it's a recognition of the ways in which public institutions, structures, ways of seeing the world an understanding of sort of how you factor into those. So a recognition of those structures, not necessarily that you're cognizant of that, but sort of a internal recognition of how you fit into those and how you separate yourself.
Yeah, and I apologize ahead of time, but yeah, I think that defining it is precisely not useful, right? I think it precisely misses the point. The point is that it's that part of me that can't be defined. That's why it's worthy of cultivation in the first place. That's why it's worthy of going after and asking after and seeking after and demanding that it not be completely co-opted or taken away from us.
Just a quick observation that it's, I see what you mean, but it looks like it's about essentially kind of a Euro-American concept of person, isn't it? So it's actually wouldn't travel far from to kind of other locations.
That's what you heard in what I said? The American concept of person?
No, Euro-American concept of person. So because actually not just you, but I think all three of you, because this is a kind of, you're talking about kind of voice, kind of you, privacy, etc., etc. So this is just I don't think it's necessarily bad, but it's kind of quite specific notion of kind of life that constitutes the background for this concept of inner life.
I feel a little bit lost because you mentioned some trends like atomization and people feel lonely and so on. So, like there are a lot of studies about it, right? So there is, for instance, in sociology, guidance, like people become more individuals, like fluid modernity and so on and so on. There are studies of atomization, like how exactly the idea of inner life is linked to all these different trends, because different scholars highlight different aspects, and that does not exactly overlap, like does not completely overlap with the idea of inner life.
For us, the question has to do with what it is that we're doing in higher education at all, right? Like what is any of this for, especially today? And if we can agree, at least a little bit, that it's for the betterment of human life and human experience on Earth, right, or on Mars or wherever, if that's the case, right, then what can our disciplines, which are not fiction, right, where we're not artists, but we actually sort of do this work of analysis and particular methods and particular frameworks and asking particular questions, what can those disciplines and those frameworks offer to not just the study of inner life, but the having of it, the living of it, right? We fantasized today about something like classes that would actually help students think about cultivating life long term, what that would look like, why they should think about university as a place where those questions are not only appropriate, but actually sort of central to what we're doing.
What Maxime mentioned just a few minutes ago, yes, there is a lot of research on loneliness, isolation, and all kinds of topics like that. And for instance, from my sociological standpoint, like when you introduce the idea of inner life into any kind of sociological discussions, people say, oh, what's going on there? People are very uneasy, right? Psychologists look at the individuals. Philosophers, artists talk about expressions or ask more direct questions. So there is a gap, right? So you have a lot of empirical research in the land of psychology that looks at all kinds of symptoms related to inner life, and then you have philosophers, artists who discuss that as expressions, and ask all kinds of sort of vital questions. So how can we bridge those? How can we tackle that gap between the two?
Can you tell me, and I know there's a lot of directions, a lot of questions, can you tell me what kind of an educational space, it doesn't have to exist, it's not like that kind of question, just what kind of characteristics of an educational space could be created, whether it's you all creating it or whether it's, could be created in a small way, whatever scale, but could be created that would be kind of receptive to this kind of teaching and learning?
I mean, I teach philosophy, right? So it's easy in a way for me. One thing I'd like to do is teach a course. I was thinking about this actually on the plane on the way here. I'd like to teach a course called Interiority and Intimacy. But the key is that I'd like it to, oh, and if anyone wants a syllabus, I've got one ready to go. Your daughter's gonna love it. The key to it for that's true, no, I know. The key to it for me would be to teach it over the course of the academic year, for example. Not only because I'm obsessed with this subject and I'd like to give it more than a semester of time, right? But because teaching it over the course of the academic year, asking students to commit to 2 semesters. I know you guys work on quarters. I don't know what those are. I don't understand any of that. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to talk in terms of semesters, right? Asking students to commit to 2 semesters, one after another, makes them think about their time here differently, right? It makes them think about what they're doing here differently. Commitment, sort of the longue durée of this whole thing, rather than, 15-week units.
My question is, what do you make of the entire, how to call it, spiritualist literature of Osho and everything? If you enter a bookshop and it's all about finding the inner peace and things of the sort, and that to a certain extent contradict the fact that inner life is not important anymore.
Yeah, we find Osho as an intellectual curiosity, and we'd like to stay away from that type of discourse. Right?
Well, I totally agree that Osho is an intellectual curiosity, but it does suggest that there is an interest for inner life in the public sphere that you cannot just simply ignore.
Yeah, precisely. So New Age is an interesting example, right? And again, this, I would say, from my perspective, this is a great example of a symptom, right? So there is something going on. There is some kind of demand for this type of literature. So there's some restlessness. There's some anxiety. There's some lack of whatever spirituality of some kind of self-awareness, and people go to Osho, people go to all kinds of places.
Hannah Arendt about the kind of invention of inner life in, I guess, late Roman, early Roman antiquity or whatever, and she had a very clear point. The invention of inner life was a kind of distance, a negative reaction and rejection of Greek ideals of political participation. So for her, it's just clear negative development. We just refused to participate in the life of polis, and we escaped in our inner lives. In your case, I don't clearly see your kind of value point. So it's obviously that for you, this inner life is a question of value. We should teach it, we should protect it, but what value is at stake? It also seems to me that your framework is a kind of black and white. So there is kind of privacy and inner life and other institutions which threaten inner life. What we now see today, I think, is a proliferation of various hybrids of public and private, inner and external.
I would say there is no hybrid, and what we're seeing there instead is precisely the co-optation of inner life, so that it keeps eluding us. I don't think that there's the possibility of a hybrid between public and private. And those aren't really the categories I'm using either. I think, one way I think about this is something that Jean-François Lyotard wrote about how inner life, or what he calls the inhuman, this like mute inner self, right, is actually at the heart of the political. So it's not about moving away from the political or disavowing it. It's exactly, he says something like, the reason that rights are owed to us at all is because there's something in us that exceeds every right. Right? And so there's actually sort of if you follow that, there's potentially sort of enormous political force to protecting inner life.
Actually, I think what you're driving at is actually authenticity rather than the problem of private and the public, because the Greeks could find full realization of the self in the public and not away from the public. So that is the reason why Richard Sennett, and not just Hannah Arendt, Richard Sennett wrote a very famous book, The Tyranny of Intimacy. And that is precisely why private life can also be subject to commodification.
So I think my comment is that what we saw here with this team in particular is the result of refusing to tell us what the research question is. Because of course you can say, well, usually and normally, maybe more often than not, research is not done in this kind of linear way, right? I mean, kind of you're interested in a topic, start exploring it, and then you have to publish a thesis, you actually put a research question as the last thing, right? But if you don't have a research question, in this type of activity, when they have to formulate a project and assess a project and discuss a project and try to contribute to the project, it turns out that, you know, there is no grounds. You have a term, which is your central term, inner life, right? But obviously it has very different meanings in different fields, right? If you're talking, if your question would be, for example, how or what to do or what to, something with inner life and educational practices of today's academia, okay, you would be in the whole field, right? We will ask you a lot of questions about the traditions of thinking about that, which is huge, right? We will ask you how it's different from German romantics, or how it's different from liberal arts education theorists, who thought about all kinds of inner life, and what is your contribution here. It will be a good topic. I think we can have a team in a school that would be dealing with education as an object of research, but then you're in the field of educational studies, which is a huge field. It's not, I mean, it's not my favorite field, but it's a good field. I mean, it exists, right? You can find yourself in that field. And then you have a research question coming from that field and all other research questions. If it's a sociological thing, then it's a different thing. It's a kind of philosophical question, it's a different question, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't have a research question, we don't have an object. We have a term, we can actually have a word combination, inner life. And then everybody just comes up with their own ideas about what that could be. And then you say, well, that could be also. And it turns out that on your team, there is a complete disagreement, because we have a sociologist who is more or less about kind of your atomization kind of trends in the society. You have a philosopher who is about the values introduced in the educational system. At least for me, I don't see this so far as a kind of coherent thing. So my suggestion to you is, if you want to keep to this topic of inner life, frame it within some kind of disciplinary framework. It can be several disciplines, actually must be several disciplines because it's a multidisciplinary team, but it cannot be in this kind of imaginary transdisciplinary environment where people just talk, because otherwise we don't have a productive discussion. We just have, you know, our inner life's ideas about inner life expressed here, and maybe it will be kind of pleasant discussion, but it won't bring us closer to the idea that what your project is going to be about and whether or not we should actually include it in the SAS.
But we still have basically the same research question. How can we reimagine and reconceptualize citizenship to address contemporary challenges to it? Core to our framework is the shift in understanding of the term citizen from ancient Greek to Rome, from polites to citizen. At its foundation, this polites was not founded in the city or the state, as implied by the term citizen, but in the political. And for the Greeks, this was about human-to-human interaction, whereas for the Romans, it was about humans interacting with each other as possessors or proprietors. The Greek concept also had its own limitations, but part of our project is concerned with so-called conceptual engineering. That is, it will seek to employ the best of concepts, but also to deal with their limitations, to engineer them towards new ideas, I think. Central hypotheses, we've tweaked a bit. We will revisit this ancient notion of existential belonging and look at alternative modes of belonging from diverse historical and geographic perspectives that are unified by an existential approach. We will provide some tools for reimagining citizenship and belonging in both global and local context. Again, this is our essential part of our hypothesis is that current models of citizenship are based on a legal contractual model that originated in the Roman legal tradition and now have been reduced to the modern Western liberal dimensions of status, rights, participation, and identity. And again, to clarify how we're using some of these terms, existential belonging is subjectively meaningful for the members of the polis. Existential belonging concerns the full flourishing of human capabilities. Eudaimonia, did I pronounce it correctly? Okay. And it's literally, it is what is at stake for our being. Legal citizenship, in contrast, defines the human being as a possessor of things and renders human relationships as mediated by things. And because of this, people hate refugees because their relationship with the citizen is legally defined. Refugees threaten our things. Some of the dominant alternatives to our project include work on citizenship and political philosophy and theory by such authors as Michael Walzer and John Pocock. Theories of inclusion, for example, Jürgen Habermas. Liberal multiculturalism, Wilhelm Liska, and the focus on the 4 dimensions of citizenship is in the scholarship of Jopka and Blumerad. So this is from the 2017 Venice Biennale. The Tunisian pavilion actually issued passports, and interesting, on the application for the passport, it asks, where do you belong? But we will be asking, how do you belong?
So why do you think this is a central thing to be interested in if you are kind of, you don't like the way states work these days, right? Or states and citizen relationship work these days, by citizenship as opposed to all other issues?
One reason why we decided to concentrate on citizenship is because concepts like sovereignty, so on and so forth, I think sovereignty, modern Western political philosophy tends to fetishize sovereignty. Not all kinds of political philosophies in other cultures would look at power as the highest good. And sovereignty in Latin means the highest power. So, in the West, it had to do with the history of the sovereignty of the monarch being replaced by popular sovereignty. So the struggle is around power. But not all cultures think that power is the most important thing. Like belonging, for example, for the Chinese culture, is much more important than, fighting for my power versus your power. So that is one of the reasons why citizenship has been our central focus. It's because we are trying to look for a spatial order as well as a historical order, a temporal order, and married with the spatial order. So in other words, we are trying to prove that this is not just a matter of diversity, that we are looking for different models. But this alternative already happened in the West. It's just that it has been forgotten. It has been repressed. So we are trying to use, bring back a return of the repressed to rethink what critical power it has for us. The critical power in the Kantian sense.
I had a question about your kind of data cases selection. So you mentioned about 5 or 6 cases, former Yugoslavia, USSR, Europe. Don't you think that these cases will be kind of incommensurable? Because I expect that their acquired findings from all this context won't kind of fit your framework, which is also pretty narrow, like existential citizenship. Like when you design your research, you typically select a number of cases based on certain criteria, right? So in order to make the research consistent, because otherwise you would get total chaos with different variables, which would not fit your framework.
We just, based on the literature, which assumes that which talks about that in certain context already the belonging, or make us to assume that belonging in certain contexts was understood differently and had a different and more multi-dimensional meaning. That's why we are selecting these cases, like all these like communist citizenship with the idea of friendship, like a more comradeship and so on, for example, or like certain non-Western context, for instance. So I think that these cases will be heuristic in elaboration of the theory. Then, of course, we can, I think, may consider some cases to disprove this theory, to falsify this theory. This can also may be done in the future, but currently, yeah, it's theory building, not theory testing.
Yes, just actually, the more I'm listening to you, actually, I wonder. So you're trying to do this project about belonging, and actually going from below, from actually what are the local, indigenous, different cultural notions of belonging. So I'm at a loss.
We actually talked about this. We talked about getting rid of the word citizenship or coming up with something else. But the problem is, this is the dominant term that ties into all of these issues and these problems. Okay. And so we can force a rethinking of it, but if we just jettison it, then it becomes some more sort of free-floating term.
We have to rethink or transcend the term of citizenship, but for now, that's the only mode of engagement we have, because that's the most dominant understanding or an experience of a person in a particular time, space, and field of power.
This is much more sophisticated than just looking at how different cultures interpret citizenship. But we want to ask the critical question of why one culture, I mean, despite the same concept or despite the same cultural traditions, why one chose one path and the other chose another.
Actually, I would like to understand more about the result of the project you are dreaming of, about the impact you would like to have after finishing the project. Are you going to replace the existing legal model of legal citizenship with your new model? Or you just want to bring in another concept and open a discussion, all that stuff? So I try to understand the practical consequences of your new model of citizenship.
You know, we're researchers, so we can't say that the impact of this research will be changing policies and changing legislation, because that's something that, you know, other people do, as in, you know, parliaments and so on and so forth. I think the main idea at a conceptual level is saying to bring a new conceptualization of belonging or citizenship, you know, to throw it into the world, and, you know, from there it will be maybe taken by other people, such as politicians or whatever, or maybe not, but that's definitely not something that we as researchers have any control on.
This is, I think, a more like philosophical, like sort of realistic, cynical, right, understanding of what can actually happen. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to put an effort. As we showed, there are certain dimensions how it can be influential. So it can be influential in the studies, especially in certain contexts. For instance, approaching the questions of citizenship, subjecthood, and belonging in, like, for instance, in historical research, in research on empires, and research, anthropological, sociological research on like non-Western countries and so on. Also, but there is also for the political, let's say, and social policy stakeholders, this international organization, NGOs, civil society organizations, so they can use this a new concept of existential belonging in order to better understand what are the demands, what are the needs of the population. It's so-called bottom-up approach.
So if you say that, well, which is, I think, reasonable to say that, well, we cannot influence legislation, we can write a book, and if some politicians read it and find interesting, maybe they will do something, but it's not our job, right? Okay, I agree with that. But if what you want to influence kind of scholarly discussion on empire, I mean, do you think it is the case that existing scholarly discussion of empire is kind of blind to all these issues of belonging, and they just stupidly use the word citizenship without really understanding that it's not adequate term to describe how people in different countries felt? Because my impression, I'm not an expert in the field, would bet of that everybody understands that citizenship is a very kind of legal term, and that in fact all citizens feel differently depending on their culture, etc., even if they have the same citizenship. So what it is that you're going to change in existing discourses, historical discourses, for example, about European history or about any other history for that matter?
Indian communists had a real relation with the Russian communists, by which the guy who actually established Indian communism, through the mediation of Lenin and his party, established communism in Mexico and in Turkey. So it is this idea of belonging which goes beyond the notion of national belonging into the creation of the Communist Brotherhood and people internationally that actually had real socio-political and historical relevance, by which actual events of formation of the Communist Party in Mexico and Turkey took place through the intervention and application of Indian Party.
So what you're saying is that there are other forms of belonging besides citizenship which mattered historically, right?
Which historically
And you're given one example.
I'm giving you one
just
example.
There are a lot of examples.
Yeah, there can be hundreds.
And we know that before your project. Of course, nobody thinks that citizenship is the only thing that builds communities together. You see your project looks like, because if you are doing legal stuff and say, well, all these stupid officials think that citizenship is the only thing that matters, but look, life is much more complicated and diverse. But scholars knew altogether there are kind of millions of forms of belongings, they matter, there are all kinds of brotherhoods, communist, non-communist, anti-communist, whatever, right? So what is it exactly that your project is going to bring to these discussions?
Well, I mean, I can give a very quick example about the refugee problems. For example, I mean, so many people, I mean, nowadays, I mean, the so-called right-wing exclusion of refugees, it has to do with the fact that when we understand citizenship in legal terms, we look at people as, I mean, we relate to each other as possessors of property. So we see the refugees as competing against our rights, our property. Whereas, I mean, when you change the concept, instead of saying citizenship, instead of basing human relationship on propriety, I mean, on property, when you change it to, I mean, like the Greek concept of citizenship as the fulfillment of the fulfillment of human potentials. So, let me just briefly explain this. In the case of refugees, if you change the idea that we look at them as proprietors, and if we look at them in terms of the politics of recognition, that we recognize them as human beings with human feelings who can feel hurt.
Wait a second. I mean, this is what your team does all the time. It switches between political issues and the scholarly issues, right? Politically, if you change the way an average German citizen kind of views refugees, it will be very important, very good. But you have no means to do that because precisely you're not politicians. But what you can change academic discourse. In academic discourse, nobody views refugees the way you're describing them. That's a kind of popular view, maybe it's widespread in some European countries, but this is not how scholars perceive refugees now, right?
On empires, I'm not familiar with the whole literature on empires. I'm mostly post-colonial approach. So basically, this is an idea that citizenship was, in a sense, split. So you had civil society in colonial countries as sort of like citizens with all these like the same dimension, rights, rights, participation, and status. And then you have like informal, internal domain. I think this is how it's called. And so the deprived people who lived by other standards, subjects in a sense. So basically, this new look at the citizenship can provide both a certain yardstick to see to what extent like the notions of these dimensions of citizenship are even applicable to the elites in the colonial society, and also if there may be something, and how do we approach the issue, what was the belonging and citizenship in the...
All right, just to conclude, I think my recommendation to the team, right, is that tomorrow, if you stay with this project, make it clear what you do for different audiences, right? What you do for academics who write histories of empire, for example, or for post-colonial world, what you do for this kind of studies of happiness, which is not really academically serious, but which is important because, I mean, people look at all these indexes and maybe there is this niche that has, requires actually more complicated and more nuanced and maybe different views, right? That would be something that Denis, I think, would appreciate. When we have a Skolko, we have this notion that there is a kind of a genre of a paper that an executive can read on a plane from Moscow to London, right? So that's about the same size, the same level of complexity. So it's not a scholarly paper, but it's not an article in a newspaper either, right? So this is a kind of the report, and I think something like happiness studies would fit exactly this genre, right? So something like that, maybe there is something to do on citizenship. And then what you do for politicians if you still have this as the audience of, I don't know, something to influence the way people perceive immigrants anywhere.
I have a comment and a question that you're connected. My comment is, it seems like you don't need to do any research because you already have your answer that the belonging should be existentially inclusive and great and communist in nature and everything and so on and so on and so on. Very positive. So my question is, considering that Greek society you are so fond of, the eudaimonia, also was based not only in inclusion but quite a substantial exclusion of many different peoples, right? Are you prepared to find in your specific research, in your empirical research, going through different peoples, to find that that existential belonging based on exclusion, and actually people rather hate most of others than actually love them? And what kind of will you be prepared for this sort of conflict between your ethical stance and your empirical findings? Thank you.
It's always informative for both research and policy. Some things are counterintuitive. There are studies in citizenship, for instance, recently, which make us to rethink like certain notion that, for instance, in terms of liberalization, in terms of opening for the migrants, authoritarian regimes, at least in Latin America, has been far more welcoming than, like, you know, democratic regimes in Europe. And but it's not like to say to advocate for authoritarian regime, but to take seriously this factor and try to think of what we can do with it. So it's not necessarily that if we find something nasty, it's not necessarily that, like, you know, we stay away from it. We will see it as a challenge.
The fact that some kind of existential belonging could be problematic, like the Nazi kind of existential belonging, does not mean that existential belonging is the thing to be blamed. Because meaning is not just textual, but also contextual.
In ancient Greece, this idea of citizenship was not only an idea, but also a particular institutional design, right? Exactly. So, for instance, if you do not participate in politics, you could even be ostracized, right? Exactly. You can, like, left the city. And there are different institutional means, actually, to force people to participate. They were paid money, for instance. And when I think about your project, you seem to focus on this conceptual lens and participation in politics and social life and existential modes of belonging. And, like, there's a bulk of research disciplines like political communication, political psychology, political reasoning, whatever, who now try to who also deal with this problem of kind of civic apathy. And what they focus on now is constraints, political, economic, and also cognitive constraints. And the problem they find is that the problem is not with concept, but that it's hard to actually force people to, practice citizenship. So the problem is that they say is we need to redesign institutions, to invent an institution which would actually provide people with stimuli to participate, to practice citizenship. And this kind of talk about conceptual side of citizenship is kind of disjointed from this real institutional design thing.
Do you redesign institution without redesigning concepts? How do you do that, actually? When we talk about marriage as an institution, and then from marriage to you go to living together as an institution, there's a primal shift of concept as well, right? You know, so concept and institution don't go separate.
What I mean, I guess, is if you look at contemporary democracies, you actually will see that many of them include certain part of your idea of existential citizenship. There is an ethos of participation. So there is the idea of informed citizen who is kind of assumed to participate. So this is probably the problem with citizenship and practicing citizenship. It's not only conceptual.
This project is called First Contact. We wanted to do something a little differently today. We were very fortunate to have Margaret with us. Here, the central hypothesis is that if we reimagine contact as non-discursive, it expands the options for not only imagining contact as rapport rather than confrontation, but also rapport itself. Our central research queries are, One, are we interesting? And this is important. We're trying to make contact with either extraterrestrials or anyone else, cetaceans. Are we interesting enough to talk to? What are the limitations of non-discursive contact at large scales? In the extraterrestrial sense, is it going to be a one-on-one meeting? Is it going to be isolated like it is in the movie Arrival? Or is it going to be Independence Day style, big ships, large cities, etc.? How do differences in sensory perception affect contact? This was important. The reason we chose extraterrestrials as kind of the stress test for this model is because it kind of throws all our presumptions out the window. And what are the inter and intracultural analogies that help us understand behavioral responses to first contact? So what's the relevance? It offers a model for first contact communication that isn't reliant upon the preconceived and instinctual notions of what the primary challenge may be. We always start with the question, how will we communicate, as if A, that will be the primary challenge, and B, that we aren't already communicating. I don't know if any of you have seen Galaxy Quest. We've been transmitting stuff into space for a very, very long time. Communication can often precede contact. In short, we wanted a development of a non-discursive model of first contact. A model developed for the most extreme event, extraterrestrial, has models for other communication challenges which might benefit from non-discursive contact, such as children with autism spectrum disorders and other neurological disorders.
Yeah, thank you. So have you considered the field of biosemiotics, or even going back to like Jacob Van Uxel or Pierce, and we've been contacting and having rapport with non-human animals for a long time, and there's been research in this that I think would be very, very helpful and very important for you to consider.
Yeah, personally, I'm not very familiar with those authors. I mean, this is something that we only started now, but yeah, I'll certainly look into it and see how it ties into the whole thing.
Either you should say that, well, biosemiotics is not relevant for our research because, and give me a reason why, this is not biosemiotics. Or you should say, no, yeah, biosemiotics is exactly one of the fields involved in our research, and there is an expert on the team on biosemiotics who will give you like a list of 100 authors who've been writing about that recently. So which one would you choose, and what is your answer?
So my contribution to this was supposed to be about cetaceans specifically, right? And how to think about cetaceans not necessarily as animals at all. So someone like Wexkull or Peirce, those wouldn't even really be necessarily the right names to use when we're talking about whales, right? So, I mean, there's a reason that Wexkull is writing about the tick, right? There's a big difference between the tick and cetacean life.
Right, I guess I'm a little confused what cetacean life means.
Cetacean, whales, like whales and dolphins.
Yeah, citation to me means like the little thing in a paper.
Right, so the word cetacean refers to whales.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're talking about whale life, Maria.
Yes, I'm talking about, animals. So the interesting question for me in this,
and how they
personally,
communicate.
Yeah.
So are you a marine biologist, or?
Do I have to be in order to talk about something? I'm not a marine biologist.
My point is, so biosemiotics is an important field that's been going on for a long time that has been interested in first contact or rapport between non-humans and humans. There are other ways to talk about this, but this is an important field. And it to me, you may have other expertises too, and so I'm interested in just hearing more about what
that's what I'm trying to do.
Is.
Right.
So I'd like to hear.
So the interesting thing to me about whales is that we're looking at creatures that ostensibly have language, and that by itself doesn't help us communicate with them. So, for example, what would it mean to enter into extended, maybe deeper relationships with other creatures that have language, right? And despite that, we can't talk to them.
Biosemiotics isn't about talking to animals.
I'm not talking about biosemiotics.
I know, but it seems like you're saying biosemiotics is this, and what's different about what I'm doing is that these animals aren't about us communicating with them. What's your? I'll leave it at this because it's not a problem. I'm just like, I guess who who else does these types of studies, I guess, this citation studies? Like, what are you're not a marine biologist, so what are your sources? Yeah, I mean, I think we're actually quite interested in some of the same things. Who are the people that you use to do this type of theory, to study whale language? Do you use, who are the linguistic theorists?
There was a whole tradition in the 60s, right? I mean, there was a moment in the 60s.
Yeah, I don't know, so I'm wondering some of the
of actually doing the work of trying to talk to whales and dolphins specifically, right? So there was I don't know. I mean, I read John Lilly. I read these sort of now obsolete kind of people for whom this was very much a political project, a sort of utopian project. Okay. Yeah, and how they, well, yeah, and I mean, I don't know.
So you want to kind of resurrect the field that went obsolete in the 70s?
No. One doesn't only read things in order to resurrect them.
Actually, have a suggestion and a question to more to Louis. So it seems like you were really excited about the autism part, right? So, but is it something that you ever had any experience with? Or like, at least, do you have any roadmap as to what and how you can actually contribute to that part?
Yeah, so neurodevelopmental disorders is one of the things that I'm conducting research on. I'm a co-PI in a big $2.2 million grant on autism, but more on the genetic part in Qatar. Yeah. So, you know, so this experience that I gathered with animal behavior over the years, I want to start transposing into humans and moving more into the field of psychophysics. So this is how I would like to tie in my current to my future research in this context.
And I have a quick suggestion, actually. So while listening to this discussion, it made me even rethink my own research. So, and I mean, as you know, like most of the biomass on our planet, so would be bacteria. And bacteria are the organisms which actually don't have any verbal communication. So they have only this type of communication that you're talking about. And this is extremely hot and sexy topic these days because it's at the actually very base of the problem of drug resistance and finding the better antibiotics. And because that's how they communicate with each other. And maybe you can actually create some sort of a project which would be first of its kind in the whole field. So it's like would be completely your own niche. Like when you philosophically look at this problem. So nobody did that for sure.
About bacterial communication, you mean?
Just a very simple question. Sort of, I understand. Sort of, you're interested in autism in this project. Marjorie is interested in with whales, in kind of contact with whales and kind of similar kind of species. What about you two? What sort of empirical sort of case studies of first contact, or the kind of empirical sort of research that you'll be doing?
For myself, I'm going to be doing more of a social psychology and political psychology, the limitations of large scale, because the whole point of developing this model is to stress test it first for, like I said, the extraterrestrial event. So that's what I'd be looking at, I believe.
Yeah, from an anthropological perspective, we have a lot of examples, ethnographic examples of first contact, particularly in Papua New Guinea, where we have actual footage of first contacts between Highlanders and Australian miners. The New World, the Americas, are full of first-hand accounts of first contact and how people responded. And then interesting sort of side effect of that is the relationship between cultures back in Europe and their impression of those first contacts as compared to, say, the people who are actually involved in the first contact. Very different responses. You read some of the conquistador accounts. Quickly, there was a recognition that they were all human, even in spite of some of the mythology that we have, that they thought they were spirits and things like that. It didn't take them long to figure things out. And there was actually a very respectful, often, relationship between conquistadors and the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, who they were sometimes conquering and sometimes allied with, sometimes marrying and intermarrying with. So yeah, there's a whole dimension of that in the ethnographic literature, and that's something I'm fairly familiar with and can bring to the picture.
Yeah, at the SAS we distinguish between two types of collective kind of multidisciplinary projects, right? So the first one would be, well, we call it collected volume. You have an umbrella metaphoric topic, like, for example, in your case, it will be like nonverbal contact. And you have people from different disciplines writing about that. If you plan to do a real joint project, what would be the use, for example, of historical evidence from, I don't know, from European contacting someone in the New World for bacteria and vice versa? What is in common between the whale language and sci-fi literature, right? So what is the kind of a framework, methodological, philosophical, conceptual, that can possibly bring all this together?
Just for what we're talking about, there's a biological aspect of it. There's an anthropological aspect of it. When you look at the instinctual responses, it's almost looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the processes that you're going to go through instinctually. You superimpose your cultural values on top of that meeting. So it's very transdisciplinary. I mean, you could probably bring in a scholar from every field that exists and have them have input into it, but obviously we have what we have, and we're looking at the skills that we have and how we can load those in, recognizing that we're going to have to broaden our horizons a little bit to deal with some of these topics. Semiotics, I think, is very good. That there is a body of literature and scientific research that we're going to have to bring in at various levels, some with deeper research and some can be dealt with more superficially.
Right.
My question has to do, so my question is about your first research query, namely, are we interesting? I would like to know whether, how do you think about approaching, what would be the methodology of answering this question? Also considering that, if we broaden the scope, it's a question with relevance beyond your project. It's a question that I've been asking myself in the past 2 days. Are we interesting here? So how do you think you could approach that?
I think the way to know whether or not we are interesting, right? It's kind of like knowing whether or not you're sexy. How do you know if you're sexy? Anybody? How do you know? You don't know by looking in the mirror, right? You know by means of contact. This is the kind of thing one can know, if you will, right? Only as a result of this kind of experience, right? With someone who isn't me. So, yeah. So I don't think that our project is meant to answer the question, are we interesting? I'm sorry. But I do think that that's one of the important questions to ask when we're looking at the non-discursive, right? And I think to return to Andrei's question a little bit, one of the things that unified us, at least briefly, is this hypothesis that the move to the non-discursive would help us sort of shift the imaginary of contact from a kind of confrontation, right? Like the door opens and the aliens stand there and we stand there looking at them and they're looking at us and we're looking at them and they're looking at us, and then what happens, we don't know, but it's this idea that it's this kind of almost traumatic confrontation to the space of what Jay likes to call rapport, right? I talk about affinity and the libidinal aspects of meeting and of contact, right? But I love this idea as sort of almost a more abstract idea of rapport. And what would that mean? One knows when one has rapport. One also knows when one doesn't have rapport, right?
Yeah, I just want to mention that Anna Karenina at a certain point feels that her eyes are shining in the dark, talking about whether or not you can know you're sexy without an external observer. Yes, please.
This is a question for you. When you were describing these moments in contact zones of empire, you described them as sort of friendly moments of recognition. This seems to be a different picture than how some historians and some anthropologists have described things. And I was wondering if you could sort of expand on what you mean by that and what's happening in these zones.
Yeah, I didn't mean to give that as the impression. What I wanted to do was counter the impression that it was completely hostile and brutal and savage, which it often was. But there were also, intimate relationships between others, that people establish these rapports. And again, it goes back to that process of building rapport and understanding. Cortez was successful because he made friends with the Tlaxcalans. And so, having allied with the kingdom, after having fought several battles with them and killed many of the Tlaxcalans, he became allies with the Tlaxcalans and then entered their war with the Aztecs. And Montezuma, who's often seen as crazy, for his response that he was mystified by these foreign people, he invited Cortez into the center of Tenochtitlan, the city, allowed them to live in his father's palace, which is exactly where he wanted them, because he could control them then. And they were locked in the city, and when things turned bad, he had them besieged in the city, and they barely escaped out of there with their lives to make it back to the Tlaxcalans, to regroup, plus being supported by a smallpox epidemic that was breaking out through the Aztec Empire, and then eventually conquered the Aztecs after besieging Tenochtitlan for I think it was 9 months. So yeah, it was not a friendly encounter. And like I said, the response, I was a police officer for 10 years. The first thing I would do when I meet a first contact with somebody is I assess the threat. And I think there's an instinct in humans to assess the threat when they walk into a new situation. And then we superimpose cultural expectations on top of that, and cultural norms of behavior that help us regulate those instincts. But those are definitely part of the process of first contact.
The impediments to contact is, I would say, conceptual blind spots, or the things you don't know. And it strikes me that you guys are all academic materialists, judging by the things you said about libido and conceptualizing aliens as coming down in spaceships, or what you said about first contact with indigenous people. And it made me think about, for example, St. John of the Cross, who said the first language of God is silence, and if you want to make contact with God, you need to stop talking. Or The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a medieval contemplative manual where the novice monk is told to keep this knowledge away from academics because they'll destroy anything like this that they come in contact with. Or indeed, Whitley Strieber's book Communion, about making contact with an alien that he finally kind of speculates is some unknown aspect of his own soul. And there's a whole non-materialist tradition of thought about contact, and I wonder if you think that your materialist lens is going to enable you to make contact with it.
So I think this is a great question. Actually, I'd love to hear about how you do it, right? I mean, so when we're talking about cetaceans, especially, right? When we're talking about a being that vocalizes, one of the problems with how we've been trying to communicate with or understand cetaceans is precisely that we've just been making a ton of noise around it, right? It's all about talking, more talking. Can we make them talk? Can we, record their vocalizations and play them back to them to see if they then vocalize back to us? And it's just a bunch of noise, right? So one of the reasons we want to turn to the non-discursive is precisely to point out that maybe listening is important here, right? Rather than filling the space. So in order for a rapport to happen at all, I mean, and maybe this is some sort of mystical point, so I'm sort of uncomfortable with this idea, but maybe in order for a rapport to happen is one has to precisely create space for it to happen, right? Because that's what we mean by silence. We don't mean a sort of lack of engagement. We don't mean a lack of interest, right? Presumably, St. John of the Cross is interested in God. I mean, I don't know.
Then I would have a follow-up question. We recently discussed with Yuri, right, about we discussed science, but still, I mean, where scientific collaborations take place. Here's a very easy notion of that. I say, well, scientific collaboration takes place when somebody says, well, I have something, and the other person from my neighboring field or other field says, well, that's exactly what I need. That's exactly what I lack to do my research. And then real collaboration actually emerges. What is the need in each of these fields for the other field?
we're not puzzle pieces. You know, that we have our own unique piece, and once we put it in there, and then if you put it all together, it all comes together. We're dependent on each other's fields. We're dependent on each other's research for this. I could do a paper on the limitations of non-discursive strategies for contact at large scales. I could do that. But if I want to talk about that in a contact relevant, I need the anthropological end of the probably thousands of cases of contact that exist, the case studies for anthropology. I need to be talking about non-human cetacean linguistics, why it failed in the 60s, where it's at now. Are we just making a bunch of noise there? We need our biologists because this has actual consequences for human beings.
So yeah, I think that's just a small thing to add. You know, personally, I don't know how you feel, probably the same way I do. I couldn't have come up with this project alone, right? And you know, say, picking your example, you know, bringing philosophy into the bacterial lives, I would need her. So I guess that for all of the examples that we could come up with between ourselves, I mean, I very quickly, personally, would hit a wall. So even the field of social neuroscience is a new field which kind of tries to bridge the social sciences and neuroscience together, and it actually borrows some methods commonly used in social sciences. For example, in neuroscience, you know, the biggest question perhaps, you know, we're trying to understand our own brain, right? I mean, how can we understand the very thing that we use, right? So, you know, there's we call it the big C question, or the big C word, consciousness, right? We don't speak about consciousness in neuroscience. If you try to publish a paper with a C word, then the reviewers will tear you apart. So they renamed it to awareness, because awareness presupposes links it to perception, which is more testable from a, you know, traditional neuroscience point of view. So yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, you need, for example, philosophy or even physics in some of the major questions that neuroscience is trying to answer.
The question is less about sort of trying to formally justify these relationships and how they work fantastically well together, and more sort of about looking at who's shown up for the party, who's showing up to do the work, and why, right? What draws certain disciplines to this question, for example? Not all disciplines will be drawn to this question, and that's okay too. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it would be another way to answer this, sort of from exactly the other side, which is less about how these disciplines hang together before this problem, and more about, we've got a problem, who wants to come do the work?
I'm very interested in this possible collaboration between kind of neuroscience and social sciences, because you probably, if you continue to pursue this topic, you'll have to deal with neuroscience, because it's non-discursive communications are extensively studied in this field. And I was just wondering, like, it typically looks like this. So we now, for instance, now we know that we process images very differently than words. We process them much faster. This process is non-sequential. The small chunks of information contain much more information than words. And these findings are based on neuroscience data. Or, for instance, there is a studies of emotions. We now know that we first kind of get emotional response, and then comes cognition, though like a couple decades ago there was Lazarus theory saying that the first cognition comes first and then emotion. So like it's a kind of one-way process. So neuroscience data informs social sciences, and social science adjusts this new kind of findings. Is there any way to like move in another direction? Can social sciences inform neurosciences? So because typically it's just one-way process. We first get some data about neural paths, and then we adjust our ideas in social science.
Yeah, I think so. You know, for example, I'll give you an example about some concepts from the social sciences that I would like to apply to some of the research questions that I historically have been interested in. For example, social inequality or social isolation, right? We know that, social inequality is a very big problem in the world that we live in. We know that it has a lot of really bad, health consequences for the people in the lower socioeconomic backgrounds, right? Now we know, for example, the ratio of obesity amongst people who are poor in the Western world, at least, is very, very high. And this is not mainly because of biology. I think it's mainly a sociological, phenomenon, right? So, one of the things that we could do is grab those concepts that sociology, the social sciences, for example, have been studying for decades, right? And, bring them to biology and model using, for example, an animal model in which you can ask more naive questions, removing the human part out of it to look at more innate components or more hardwired components and kind of use it in that fashion. In my field, in the neurosciences, typically neuroscientists, biologists in general, look down on the social sciences and humanities. Personally, I think it's wrong, because I think we have a lot to learn particularly from the social sciences in my field.
So we began by conceiving of this group as a way to deal with a gap. We see an intergenerational gap between an older group that works with established government institutions, power structures, and forms of capital, such as economic, social, and cultural, as well as a younger group that has been excluded and disenfranchised from those exact institutions and structures and conversations. Now, this dynamic has led to the creation of an environment in which younger generations are increasingly atomized, placed in precarious economic and social conditions when they're unable to communicate with older generations. However, these younger generations do have their own forms of community, their own networks that are not traditionally recognized and have usually fallen outside of disciplinary focus. Out of this hypothesis, we figured a few research questions that we could ask. How are new communities formed and sustained? What is their self-understanding? And how do they function? How do these new communities communicate their identity? How do they get this across in online situations, in-person situations, in a variety of different circumstances? What types of intersectionality exist between different communities? When we talk about intersectionality, we tend to think about it as an individual, that a single person identifies as a certain gender, racial group, those sorts of things. We've proposed bringing intersectionality into communities. How can these new forms of communities be put into dialogue with prior forms, so bringing in a temporal aspect, bringing in a historical focus?
We don't subscribe to the traditional notions of community that are spatially bound, that look at racial, ethnic, and other types of categories. We look at what's going on in 2018 with all kinds of developments, digital, and so on and so forth.
Maybe in positive sociology, your target is this positivist, what did you call it, community studies that formed in the 1970s. But this seems like a really old fight that has been fought for a long time. Who cares about these guys? And I think Max pointed out that they're not really that relevant today either. Hannah Arendt and Arendtian scholarship talks about communities of taste that transcend spatial boundaries. Nancy published in like the mid-'80s this inoperative community. There's a long literature in political theory really contesting this idea that communities are spatially bounded or geographically bounded, and what relates us is being in the world or togetherness on a much different level than hey, I'm sitting next to you, or you're my neighbor. So I'm wondering why you're identifying why you're framing your debate with this very outmoded, and everyone agrees, outmoded field.
I'll start. So part of the reason was institutional related, that even though in some ways the area studies debate is a past debate, it still very much informs scholarship, in that
it's area study centers that give grants to produce research. And so they produce a very specific kind of research because they're appealing to the people who work for those area study centers. And so even though this has been something that's been talked about for a while, it's been something that's been very difficult to jump over because of those institutional structures are in place to today.
Which I like what you say content-wise, but I think the community studies are obsolete not because actually they're focused on something local or territorially bound, but actually because of a holistic perspective on on imagining what society is basically. So of course, what you don't you think that it's much more interesting to look at sort of other things which actually replace the concept of community, which would be like networks or, I don't know, partial connections, sort of connections to part rather than part to whole, etc., etc. So something actually kind of experimentations, which are actually quite numerous. And you can think of anthropology, I don't know, actor network theory, I don't know, kind of media studies, whatever, that try to conceptualize this sort of actually existing connections. Some other people talk about scapes, like ethnoscapes, etc., etc. So there's I mean, why do you need to, you know, can you possibly revive this notion of community without actually taking sort of, also reviving this sort of holistic view that actually doesn't, in my view, doesn't need to be sort of revived?
But why would you, if you want to theorize communities in a new way, in a totally new fashion, why would you need the concept of society? And why would you presuppose that communities are part of this holistic notion of society, as was mentioned by Nikolai? Why would you do that?
Okay, I'll give you a short answer. I mean, as a sociologist and as sociologists in general, we actually don't like the word society because it's quite useless. So what actually happened is that this is a new group. We had just a few hours and somehow the word society crawled in and escaped my censorship. You see, this is what happened. It shouldn't be there. Get rid of society. This is a useless word.
What is then about social disintegration? What exactly do you mean by social disintegration if you get rid of the concept of society?
I noticed that in this slide, and as you've been talking, there's, you know, the younger generation. When we look here, there's this gap between an older group and a younger group. Who are you talking about? And or is this some sort of global? I mean, you know, we know that there's lots of literatures on history, anthropology, etc., right? And you know, in like, you know, in a certain moment, there's this sort of a politics emerges of young versus old, or youth is conceptualized in some way. I wasn't sure if that's sort of an object of your knowledge, this sort of youth, meaning it's something that's emerged in the world that you're looking at, or whether it's more of a quantitative, you're taking this category, I think at some point it was mentioned like 18 to 64.
I mean, to go back to the original question, I would suggest that of course, there's no universal youth. I mean, that would be totalizing and reductive and just completely unhelpful and unscholarly. But what I would argue is that there are social, economic, and cultural conditions that sort of inform youth and create this sort of idea of precarity in a way that's substantive across different areas and different geographical regions.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Sorry, there's things that inform youth. So you're using this object youth, but then you're saying there is no universal youth. I'm just not understanding what this unit is.
You're right in the sense that there is always a certain disconnect between younger, different generations, younger, older, right? Here, I'll give you one example.
That's not what I was saying. I mean, even the idea of a generation, the idea of a youth, adolescence was something that was invented, right?
Yeah,
it's a social
but then it becomes
not
a social
universal
fact, right?
It's not necessarily a universal fact, right? I mean, that's what I'm asking. Is the youth a universal fact? Maybe it is. I'm just asking about your project.
Youth is a social fact in sociological terms.
Everywhere. It's a social fact.
Well, youth is defined differently in different contexts, right? Slightly differently in different contexts. But youth, the whole idea of youth is a concept, but it is relevant to people's life, right? There is a certain global idea of what a young is, what youth is. There's some kind of youth culture. There are studies of young people's literature, for instance. That's a thing, right?
Yeah, that's a thing within print culture of a certain kind, within a marketplace, within an industry that distributes to certain people. I mean, we can provincialize these concepts.
I also actually, when you started your presentation, I was feeling a little bit uncomfortable about why you single out age as the division line for community and communication. I mean, the impossibility of getting one's voice heard is not just a matter of the young people, but of the powerless on the whole. And age is not the only thing that creates power and powerlessness. And another thing that I think you might want to take into consideration is that different cultural concept of time defines age and children differently. For example, both the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, and the Chinese in the past, before modernization, venerates age. That is why, I mean, like, even the word Senate came from the Latin word meaning, I mean, which reference age. But, I mean, when you have cyclical concept of time, those who are older have accumulated lots of experience. That is why people defer to age, because history keeps repeating itself, and those who have gone through it would know better. However, I mean, once you start having the linear concept of time, which was the hallmark of modernity, then the veneration of the young, of the youthful is being associated with the progressive, the cutting edge, I mean, the future, because it's the future that matters. The past is being left behind. So, I mean, so definitely, I mean, whether society venerates the old or the young, have to do with their concept of temporality in the first place, which I think has been left out of your project.
Okay, two quick things. First, one suggestion, maybe for this generational thing, you might think about future generations. There's a lot of work in environmental political thought about our responsibility to future generations and how we form communities with future generations. Related to that was Nikolai's suggestion about ANT theory and how we form communities with the non-human world. I think both of those are important points. So that could sort of blur, but could still go along with this generational gap. Secondly, I want to still try to pinpoint what's original about this project, because the more I sat here, the more I'm continuing to think it sounds a lot like the citizenship team. You both have this interesting, you both have this old word, community, citizenship. It has rich and strange potential that you're trying to retrieve and pull into the future and do something theoretical and somewhat practical with it. And if we have two teams here doing basically the same project, I'm sure there's many elsewhere. What makes you original?
All right, our project is called First Contact. Our central hypothesis is that if we reimagine contact as non-discursive, it expands the options for not only imagining contact as rapport rather than confrontation or threat, but also for rapport itself. Our research queries are we interesting? What are the limitations of discursive and non-discursive contacts at large scales? How do differences in sensory perception affect contact? What are the inter- and intracultural analogies that help us understand behavioral responses to first contact? And what are the limitations of threat assessment as a basis for current anomalous public policy? The research fields involved are philosophy, specifically critical animal studies and sexual studies, neuroscience, behavioral and social neuroscience, anthropology, this guy, specifically ethnographic analogy and participant observation, political science with specialization in governance and public policy, and myself, psychology, discourse analysis. There's a lot of interdisciplinary connections. We chose the main ones here between biology and philosophy. There are limitations of biological and physicochemical, nailed it, measurement require more fundamental questions, such as what is intelligence and vice versa, how does sensory perception affect relationships. Between political science and psychology, policy process involves high levels of persuasion, which have traditionally been a function of dominant discourses. Between philosophy and psychology, it bridges the gap between affect theory and discourse analysis. And between anthropology and biology, it bridges the gap between biology and behavior. And here's the project relevance outside academia. A, it provides credible research backing to advocating for the consideration of non-discursive strategies employed for post-detection event. That's actually meeting aliens. Provides a research platform into non-discursive interventions for neurological disorders, and provides credible research backing for debates concerning non-human persons, for example, the Declaration of Rights of Cetaceans and the Great Apes Project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So my question is, since this is actually the second day when we are discussing this issue, I just wonder, what are your thoughts about actually the problems that you might encounter when you're actually looking at the non-discursive? So, I mean, my question arises from sort of my reading of like sensory ethnography, which is sort of like a similar trend that you are talking about, but actually happens more specifically in anthropology. And the difficulty which is there is that firstly, when we study sensory encounters, or actually sensory landscapes, tactility, gaze, smell, etc., firstly, our descriptions of that are discursive. So what we do, we translate non-discursive into discursive. And secondly, when we do that, we actually end up being pretty Eurocentric. So it's actually quite specific sensory landscape that we mean by when we actually are doing this translation. So we kind of, it becomes this sort of relativistic loop. We go back to, firstly, to discourse, and then not to understanding this kind of non-discursive encounter, but actually translating it into familiar territory.
Suggested the idea of, instead of using language or whatever, just offering a drink to whatever being you were first contacting. And I thought, oh no, that's a discourse as well. You go into the richest businessman's office, and what has he got there in the corner? He's got brandy. He's got, you know, even if he's talking to his opponents or his enemies, let's have a drink. You know, let's build some rapport first. It's just not for them. I mean, you can do the same thing with very low income people. Let's share a beer. Let's go to the, you know, it's a social construct. It's this discourse that says, you know, that permeates everyone. So identifying the actual limitations is going to be difficult. I'm not denying that.
Could each of you please mention the first empirical hypothesis you would try to test?
One of the things that I would be particularly interested in is to develop quantitative methods to assess how, you know, for example, to focus on a very concrete example, children with autism, how do they sense their olfactory world? Because that's something that I know how to do well. You could develop quantitative ways and compare that, for example, to control groups, right? So if we start to understand how they react, how they behave in response to certain stimuli, you could eventually extend it from smells to loud noises, lower noises, and there's been some research in that field. You can kind of understand, start to get a better picture on how they, you know, interpret the world, and you can develop better ways to interact with these children. You can then apply, hopefully, the same strategy to a lot of other neurological disorders, either neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative. So that's something I would be very interested in.
I published a book last year. It's called Whale Song, right? So it's about whales, and I propose sort of playfully, speculatively, the idea in there that the reason that our communication experiments or attempts at communicating with whales and dolphins in experimental and sort of formal experimental contexts, the reason that those are failing is because we're just not interesting enough. So this is my, again, playful way of thinking about this. I ask the question there, why would highly intelligent, curious, highly social creatures be interested in talking to creatures that talk a lot to each other without actually saying anything? I actually think that this is a very important question to ask, right? and it goes back to the first question that we were just asked. The sensory is not the only non-discursive mode that we're interested in, right? So when we are talking about something like what makes someone interesting, I'm not sure that question can be answered in any sort of empirical mode.
Just like we go through phases of dealing with injury or trauma, psychological phases and behavioral phases, I believe that there's a pattern, a general pattern that we go through when we first meet the alien entity. The first one, well, the first group would probably fall under Maslow's sort of lower level of infrastructure to living. And so you're concerned about what is the threat to me? Is it a possible sexual partner? Can I eat it? You know, there's a series of behaviors like that, and then it goes. You'll go through a series as you deal with those. And we have some good ethnographic examples of this happening, such as in Papua New Guinea with the first contact with Highlanders, where they go through an experimental process of observing and believing that they're dealing with spirits, and then going through a series of experimental things such as smelling feces, sex, bleeding, things like that, where they make these observations and then they keep refining their hypothesis. So I think there is a structure to the process of contact. I don't think it's been well explored, and I think that is something that we can explore and define and create a model. And I haven't thought about what the quantifiables on that, but I believe there probably would be some quantifiables in that.
I would like to hear how we might have David on your policy issues speak to not to aliens, as we said, but how we might have policy issues for autism, training, new educational policies, or for indigenous people who haven't been contacted yet, like in the Amazon, or who have been contacted, but there's still issues going on here, because I think this might be a more fruitful policy papers than aliens. Thank you.
I mean, I think the first thing when we talk about finding indigenous tribes or something like that, the first focus of the policy may have to look at is to what degree do we want to actually integrate them into an existing form of society. I think that's one of the things, because do we want to actually integrate it and obliterate it, or do we want to actually respect their space and let them be where they are? Because we're just starting to understand about some of the basic things that autistic children, autistic individuals go through on an everyday basis that we accept as normal, and they do not. So for instance, if some autistic child goes to get his hair cut or her hair cut, it could be an absolutely traumatic experience. And this is one of the things that if we were able to, let's say, work integrated with the school here, then we could develop, let's say, policy approaches, more, let's say, awareness in the society of what this is all about and how we can actually make them feel more comfortable in our society and vice versa.
Yeah, we actually spent a little bit of time in our room today talking about sex, returning to your question about the first, right? Why do people have sex the first time when they do? But then there's the completely sort of second or seemingly second question of why do they continue having sex with each other? Right? How does one sustain long-term a sexual relationship, sexual desire? Where do those feelings or modes, right, come from at all? So I totally appreciate your question, and I think with First Contact we were just trying to be sort of cheeky and provocative, right? But it's what are those aspects of sustaining a relationship that would still count on a kind of firstness, right? And why is it that when we go on date night, we want it to be the first date all over again?
I keep thinking about my psychoanalytical background. And what I think about is that there is an area of studies where things like non-discursive communication is a kind of very problematic term. So according to Lacan, for instance, he is a French psychoanalyst, there is like even images or bodies or smells are also signals, right? And there is something which exists beyond discursive communication, but it's something you cannot actually bear. So like when you face a hallucination, that's an example of non-discursive communication, right? So you just fail, there is no subject on this scene. There is non-discursive communication, but there is no person who actually communicate, because it's too scary, you don't have this framework which could pacify this traumatic experience of real.
I think that's a great question too, and I'm glad you brought up Lacan, right? Because we keep using this word rapport here. And Lacan famously says, there is no sexual rapport. But no one would agree with, or no one would argue with me, right, when I say we still have sex, right? So what exactly is happening there? What are we doing there? And what about that is not reducible to empirical hypotheses, right?
I'm going to address you as a bunch of materialists again, despite Benjamin's disavowal of the term, and say that one of the traditions that has been marginalized in academia in the past century probably is the Platonic tradition broadly conceived, and it's a tradition that emphasizes the role of self-knowledge in cognition. And I wonder whether you think that first contact can be imagined intrapersonally, and how this kind of first contact might relate to the kinds of first contact with things in the outer world that you're thinking about.
That would somehow glue that to inner world topic, right?
Yeah, I don't dare bring up inner life. But I think one of the reasons for that is because when we were trying to come up with what motivates this in the first place, right? There's the larger sort of goal of just sort of getting along with others. That's what's motivating this, right? So, but yeah, of course there is something in me which is not me. That's the claim I've been making for the last 3 days, and that's certainly the first assumption of psychoanalysis, as I understand it. So yes, thank you.
I really did not understand why the communication with smell that you're talking about is non-discursive communication. I mean, the bad smell that you are talking about, a smell can be a very good smell in one culture and very bad smell in another culture. The same smell, the smell of the perspiring man in the room, you might get habituated with that smell and eventually start liking that smell, right? How can you divorce the notion of smell from any spatio-temporal context at all?
So smell has, to me, is one of, to study, is probably the most interesting sense, because, again, like I said, it goes straight, it links directly with the primal region of your brain, the reptile brain, the limbic system, however you want to call it, right? So this means that when you smell something, right, you're perceiving the cues first and consciously. It's affecting your physiology, your behavior first and consciously, okay, and then consciously. From there goes to other areas of the brain that are involved in other perception and behavior, okay? So smells, the sense of smell also has two components, innate and learned. I can tell you, like from my studies, I've done many studies in animals trying to look at these specifically. And there are very few smells that have a very strong innate component. I'll give you a quick example. Mice are afraid of a particular smell that's released by fox feces, that's released by foxes in their feces, right? But if you mix that smell with another smell that signals attraction, then the mice don't know what to do anymore. They still approach the odor, and their stress response, their physiological stress response is not activated anymore, right? So even though it has a strong innate component, right, that's hardwired, if you will, you can still change the meaning of that with another learned cue, right? So it's a very complex thing. So it's not linear, it's not binary. So it's tricky. I think I agree with you. And I think this is why we need to draw the line, start with some presuppositions, and go from there. But we need to have something to start with.
Yeah. How can failure to establish sustained systematic communication with whales and dolphins shape or inform an alien contact policy or autism research protocol?
The failure, you mean? Right, you're interested in, the question is interested in sort of the productive aspects of failure.
No.
Okay.
Well, yes, maybe you can make them productive, but
I don't know, I'm asking you, Duskin.
It seems there's been sustained attempts to communicate with whales and dolphins.
Yes.
But they have not established systematic, coherent communication.
Very much not.
So what can we learn from that failure that could be applied to alien contact policies or autism research protocols?
That's our question. Yeah. No, I mean seriously, I'm not chickening out completely here, but that is exactly our question. We're interested in precisely what we could learn from the failure of those experimental moments, right?
Already the second half of it. Do you think that the contact with an alien being presupposes perceiving it as somewhat human?
Well, I think when we spoke about aliens, an alien can be anything. So it can be. We would prefer it to be somewhat. I don't want to use the word that we've been avoiding all the time, but to have a consciousness or something like that. But it could be an extremophile bacteria on Mars. That's most likely the first type of aliens we're going to encounter, statistically speaking, right, or probabilistically speaking.
I think what Duskin asks is what this question actually presupposes. Term contact. It's not just getting some information. Otherwise, it's everything that's contact. You observe a star, you're on a contact with a star, get some information from its rays. But as soon as the idea of contact is there, there is an assumption that the other party is somewhat human. There's a kind of minimal level of humanity. Beyond that, you can, and the whales might not have that enough level of humanity, so that makes the contact impossible.
The sign language experiments with great apes in the 70s, the funding was pulled from those initiatives because the apes didn't ask the humans the right questions. Okay, now what is meant by the right questions and what on earth we had in mind, right, what we expected, those are not questions for the scientists, really, right? They're the questions for the rest of us.
Here is our topic, Reimagining Citizenship towards an Existential Belonging. So what is the problem in the real world that we address? We think that contemporary citizenship faces lots of challenges: refugee crisis, statelessness, differentiated denizenship, transmigration, seasonal migration, which result in the mentality of sojourning, the commodification of citizenship and granting citizenship to non-humans, and also the rise of citizenship without any substance. Our research questions are: how can we reimagine and reconceptualize citizenship to address these challenges? And what are the alternative forms of human belonging that might redefine the existing legal framework of citizenship? Central hypotheses in our research are: we think that category of legal citizenship emerged in a European context and was globalized by violent colonial processes. Despite being a global force, legal citizenship is a fundamentally flawed concept because it fails to take into account different socio-cultural contexts and the growing alienation of people from citizenship. We believe that there are already existing modes of existential belonging that exist outside of the dominant model of legal citizenship, and these modes will provide potential alternatives for application to the concept of citizenship so that we can redefine it. So now I move to some of the definitions. And first, the crucial thing is existential belonging. What is this? Existential belonging is central to the flourishing of human capabilities and the growth of human capital. We suspect, though, that existential belonging is related to the classical notion of politesse, which prioritizes human-to-human interaction over human relations to property. Existential belonging contributes to social cohesion. Existential belonging also offers us a new way to understand our collective being. So here are some research fields of our team. And we need to mention that it's not only about interdisciplinarity. Our team also is comprised of a panoply of citizens, and we have different cultural backgrounds.
I guess another way to say this is that when you define existential belonging as central to the flourishing of human capabilities,
I'm not sure if this is framed as an ethical claim, and in this sense, you're very close to like the new natural law people, like John Finnis. You're just trying to not make political changes, but it's just how we should live our lives. Or if it is a political claim, you're really close to like Martha Nussbaum and human capabilities approach. What's different? So that's for Brian. Secondly, can someone clarify for me why? I understand that refugees threaten our things and possessions. They come in, they need a place to live, they need things to eat, they might take my things to eat, they might take my wife. This is scary. But why don't they threaten existential belonging? You guys all had refugees coming to you today from the communities group, and you took some and you rejected some. So maybe reflect on that a bit. Why? I mean, you didn't have possessions, but you had existential belonging, and you rejected some from that existential belonging. Why?
Even though we have this humanist assumption, but it's an empirical question at the end of the day. Maybe we will horrified by our finding what existential belonging leads to.
I've got two questions. The first one is about it's very like particular about big data. I've seen this that you're going to study citizenship through big data. Could you clarify a little bit more? I mean, I'm just struck by the very idea. How do you study it through big data? Because big data it's something which like we use when we cannot actually apply standard methods like samples, experiments, because there is a lot of data and a lot of variables involved. So we just feed it to machine, and machine builds certain correlations, and it's typically like used by corporations who actually do not study, do not propose meaningful hypotheses. They rather look for predictions. And the second one is what struck me on the third day is I started to think about this idea about citizenship, and you are saying that this legal citizenship is very normative and restrictive. Right, so there is existential belonging, which is more, broad and not less normative. And I started to think that, this idea of existential belonging, the idea is belonging is also normative and restrictive. There are people like, for instance, Deleuze or Negri who wouldn't agree that we should belong somewhere. So we should just, move along lines like nomads. And the very concept of belonging is also restrictive and normative as legal citizenship.
I'd like to perhaps push you further to ask questions about a relationship between kind of big data and e-governance in terms of actually it's generating forms of belonging in ways in which the current citizenship is not merely a product of some kind of legal thinking, but also about some kind of data, which is actually basically biopolitics, which is data about populations, which actually started with the kind of modernity. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder if there's any kind of interesting ways in which you could take this further in using big data not necessarily as an instrument, but as a site of actually production of kind of very kind of contemporary forms of belonging, etc.
You'll have to forgive my ignorance. I'm a biologist, and we relocate refugees all the time. Animal, plant species, of course, and mostly for reasons of threat of extinction and or diseases. And some of the things that we mostly pay attention to are climatic influences. For example, you wouldn't relocate Siberian taiga to India simply because even though they are the same species, they're not well equipped to hunt the prey that's there available to adapt to these climate changes quickly or successfully. So have you considered maybe studying this from this side and implementing your recommendations in this manner? For example, recommending that refugees from Ukraine be relocated to Colorado, not to California, or that refugees from, Palestine be relocated to a coastal area. For us, that's like a very And so that can be one state, that can be one concept of citizenship, but people can perceive those environments very differently, even though the same legal laws and everything, and maybe develop this sense of belonging much quicker. Just a suggestion.
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, it's actually a really interesting question for me. Are you talking about, the climatic conditions in which, or maybe, for human, of course, it includes other cultural and social conditions, right? So, yes, the thing that you ask, actually, UNHCR has been trying to do that for the last 10 years. So what they do in case of human, of course, animal is slightly different, but in case of human, what they do is that they have this one thing is host community integration, that is in the country in which he is already there, a third country settlement, or going back to your original place, right? So these are the three things that are kind of done by UNHCR. So considering one of the central parameters, what they consider when they do that, is actually whether this particular person is comfortable within a particular socio-cultural setting for food, for way of living, for religion, considering religion and considering other aspects. So I think actually, in some sense, I can translate that, if I can translate what you said in biological terms in, socio-cultural context. So it is an ongoing process, and many organizations, particularly UNHCR, is actually doing that.
But citizenship as a passport and full rights may be counterproductive to integration. There may be a discussion in this context. The second thing is that we're also looking in different contexts, and especially in non-Western context, what is more important often, there is a book on paper citizens in India. So more important is to integrate first, then you can amass an amount of paper and quite easily, even if you're a refugee, receive this citizenship just based on documents which may be even forged. So integration here, communal interactions come first rather than status. Status in weak states with weak institutions doesn't matter a lot for integration of people. It's the other way around.
He said one thing. He said, you know what, why I like living in the UK much better than in the United States? Because in the United States, there is a demand for you to become an American, right? Because you can become an American and you're sort of required. And therefore, you have a pressure. Whereas in the UK, there is no chance you will become an Englishman. And therefore, you feel relaxed because you are legally an English citizen, but nobody presses you to become existentially English. So there is a lot of freedom actually opened up by this kind of legal framework, precisely because it's very artificial and doesn't require the change of identity, unlike this kind of belonging thing that really tries to get to your core. So do you think this is a kind of somehow challenges this overall framework that, formal citizenship is something that is bad, right? Because I hear that from your presentations all the time, that you are critical of citizenship, of legal citizenship, and think that belonging, kind of existential belonging, is somehow better for refugees and for other people who have this issue.
Listening to you today and yesterday, I noticed two key points of reference in your thinking about citizenship. One is existential belonging, and the other is eudaimonia. And existentialism philosophically is the idea that, or it's often described as the idea that existence precedes essence, and it's part of the recent genealogy of the social constructivist values of the contemporary social sciences and humanities. Eudaimonia comes from Aristotle, and who had a fixed view of human nature. And I noticed as you were casting about for people whom you could draw on to reimagine citizenship, that you looked at stateless people, and you looked at indigenous people, and you looked at Greek and Roman people, and you overlooked two places that I think possibly reveal the blind spots that are built into your worldview as academics. One is the Middle Ages, and the other is prehistory. And I was thinking in particular of Francis Fukuyama's history of the political order that came out in the last few years, in which he points out that human forms of political organization and hierarchy, did not come about at the stroke of a pen by the creation of a social contract, but they're actually carried over in large part from our primate ancestors. And evolutionary biology limits to some extent how much you can reimagine citizenship. And I wonder whether you're willing, and it's noticeable to me as well that places like the Middle Ages and like prehistory are resources for thinking about citizenship that tend to recommend themselves to conservative scholars more than to liberal scholars. And I wonder whether you're open to looking at these sources, considering that you are taxpayer-funded academics in countries where 50% and perhaps more of the population votes conservative.
If we start from a research question, those people who are excluded or alienated from legal citizenship or legal entitlements of citizenship, how do they relate to anything about any form of belonging is a pretty specific research question, which talks about pretty specific populations and areas which we are focusing upon. So if we plan to extend this research question to any other kinds of blind spot that you're talking about, it has to be, that's why I said it has to be done with certain specialization, not of Francis Fukuyama or even Huntington, but really prehistoric historians who studied prehistoric societies or Middle Ages. So it's a very empirical, specific question.
Your example reminded me of Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age economics and his idea of the affluent society. And you see there in his analysis, you see a group of people or groups of people, of course, before the state who had, in pure sociological terms or statistical terms, high levels of existential belonging. And so we see, I guess as a metaphor, I can say that when we look at sort of standard idea of citizenship or like a sort of stable idea of citizenship, it has emerged in the 19th century. So it was a certain curve, right, that goes to, let's say, the 20th century. And now we see that this idea is breaking apart, right, with e-residency, with flexible citizenship, with all kinds of mutations, transnationalism. So we see that we are at the curve, that the curve is now downwards. And so we want to capture that moment of rethinking, reimagining citizenship, and sort of, again, I guess in a sense, going back to what sort of Sahlins discussed, and what we can learn from the analysis of the affluent society. Yeah.
When you discuss the new concept of citizenship, what time horizon are you keeping in mind? I guess. Are you would like to be more focused on current issues, like you mentioned, refugees, stateless, and so on, or you would like to look a little bit into the future and on the future challenges, like artificial intelligence? Of course, I guess there are predictions that in 2030 it will be even more clever than we are, and we need to deal with it somehow. There are some other predictions on 2050 and so on and so forth. So my question, would you like to focus more on current issues and make a little kind of patch to the existing concept of citizenship? Or you would like to develop something new, and this means you will need to provide a clear picture of the world?
I will chip in there that we are a multidisciplinary team, and we look in different directions, some to the past, some to the present, some to the future. We work with different sources. Some of us work with big data. Some of us look at images and think about architecture and space. And I think that's the nature of the project, that's what we're doing that's different. We're bringing in this multiplicity of viewpoints and approaches and positioning within the problems that we face.
Citizenship is mostly given political rights to change community where they live in. And is just community afraid of change from outer world, but didn't afraid change from childs who are still different from their parents. And I mean that eternal existential existence is changing with time. And could it affect citizenship as well?
Right, but I think the question also resonated with what Denis said about whether or not you're actually interested about the future, right? Or the present problems, because I mean, whether the otherness that is at the core of your project come from. I mean, the way you describe it comes from other cultures, you know, other peoples, you know, different maybe minorities, but maybe the radical otherness comes from the new generation, which will actually mature in the age where, you know, artificial intelligence will actually decide who is a citizen, who is not. If your project, as it probably does, has a political dimension, you will encounter a situation that what you're going to propose is not going to be beneficial for everybody. It's not going to be this nice idea. Everybody will say, oh, that's actually better. Have you thought that, you know, maybe the current notion of citizenship is exactly the way it is because it benefits most, or at least most of the powerful players there is in the world? In order to change the concept of citizenship, you might actually have to change the political structure or distribution of labor, or to go back to Alex's question, really the mode of capitalism we live in. And that's not doable probably within the framework of your project, right?
I think Maxim yesterday asked the similar question. I mean, well, what to do with institutions, with the powers and so on. Yeah, I mean, like on the realistic ground, like, I mean, yes, the concepts, there are two ways to approach this question. So first of all, like a more in the Foucauldian sense, that you throw the concepts and immediately changes everything. I think this is like, yes, it changes something we need to emphasize first. But coming to the more like, you know, realistic perspective, then you need to know two things, that some of the institutions, they have vested interest in not adopting this concept, in not looking in this direction. I'm afraid that it's not necessarily that our study gonna change this power interest, but sometimes, and I would say even oftentimes, institutions do not work in certain ways because they are ill-equipped in terms of theories. For instance, take international development. There was such a debate in World Bank, UNDP, they were really trying to do something, but until very recently, I think that conceptual framework was a very influential, just a wrong conceptual framework, were a very influential factor in things going wrong.
I'm very interested in anarchism in particular and new social movements. Now, anarchism has been very unsuccessful. It had very few, you know, long-term successful experiments in this. But we see the rise of the return of some of these concepts in the form of new social movements, which is really intriguing to me. So I guess you know, I imagine that, you know, some of the ideas that we put forward would be antagonistic to existing power structures. But I mean, again, you know, our goal, I mean, it's not feasible to think that we could, you know, overturn the entire system, but, you know, beginning to make these sorts of connections seem important and interesting, and perhaps these stakeholders in these marginalized communities might find it useful. I mean, that would be the hope anyway. And then, of course, the reciprocity, being able to learn from them and to see if there are new connections that can be made. So.
You frame so much of the problem of legal citizenship in terms of refugees, human refugees, and yet on that first slide you list many different problems. One of them that I keep returning to is the question of non-humans. And you got sort of defensive when Tomislav asked the question and when John asked the question. This was a question about the superiority of the humans, or not the superiority, but this difference between the humans and these parrots. That these are different types of beings, and between prehistory of humans and this history of recordable history of humans. So I wonder if thinking more with the non-human might actually, the non-human animal, and might actually help you not be so sort of I guess reactive in these situations. That would just be a suggestion. I think this is actually a really fruitful dialogue. People are talking about this right now, and it's not just about including refugees. It's about thinking about those already present within, and how we might think about. So like Kimlicka, who I mentioned yesterday, has been thinking about different ways of granting them, or not granting them citizenship, but talking about citizenship in these terms. What I like about existential citizenship, really, for for animals is that it's not about giving them rights. Most people want to talk about giving dogs rights or the wolf rights. Existential citizenship, as I understand it from you, is not about rights. It's about belonging. It's about how we belong to the wolf and the wolf belongs to us. This would be, why are you laughing, Andre? This would be an interesting, and maybe Duskin wants to say something, but this would be an interesting concept to explore, I think. Thanks.
Do you think that for achieving multidisciplinarity, we should start with discipline itself, or multidisciplinarity has an ontology of its own?
Puts a certain demands or requirements for the ontologies of a discipline. So it still starts with a discipline, but first of all, a discipline should be thought of as problematic, as internally incomplete. Because if it's a complete discipline, you don't need anybody, right? So you're simply there. So it's an ontology of discipline that is conscious to its fundamentals, it's conscious to its restrictions, and therefore it's open for cooperation with other disciplines. I think that's an important thing. It's not an ontology of its own, right? But it's a kind of a feature of all the constitutive ontologies.
Why would highly intelligent, curious, highly social creatures be interested in talking to creatures that talk a lot to each other without actually saying anything?
And so you're concerned about what is the threat to me? Is it a possible sexual partner? Can I eat it?
Hey, listen, guys. Don't go to Boston Consulting. Don't go to any of these other major firms. Come to us.
We should conceptualize in different terms, and the meaning can be different, significance can be different of these forms of belonging.
I'm very interested in anarchism in particular and new social movements. Now, anarchism has been very unsuccessful. It had very few long-term successful experiments in this. But we see the rise of the return of some of these concepts in the form of new social movements, which is really intriguing to me.
That's what we're doing that's different. We're bringing in this multiplicity of viewpoints and approaches and positioning within the problems that we face.
I want you to turn to someone near you so that you're in pairs looking at each other. Okay? So now you're looking at someone. Okay, you guys, did you find a pair? We have a loose goose here. Would one of you join? Okay, great. So you got someone. You're looking at someone. Is there anyone who doesn't have someone? Okay, we'll match up. You have a trio. Do you have an extra over here? Go ahead, match. Okay. Okay, it's not super important. You can try the trio. Okay. I want you to close your eyes. Yes, close your eyes. And now I want you to take your own hands and rub them together. Your two hands, rubbing them to your own hands. And I want you to rub them vigorously, until your hands get hot. Get your hands hot, really hot. And when your hands are really hot, place your palms over your eyes. And just enjoy that soothing feeling. And now, when your hands cool off, go ahead and rub them again. And give yourself another dose. Okay, great. Put your hands over your eyes, warming your eyes, feeling the soothing warmth soaking through your C word, deep into your C word. Okay, great. And now, open your eyes and take away your hands and look at your partner. That's all. That's wonderful. Great.